It is said that in a small study on Mercer Street, where the light fell at precisely the same angle each afternoon, a worn leather chair held more mysteries than all the blackboards in Princeton. The armchair sat by a window not by chance, but by ancient instinct, catching the slanted rays that transformed ordinary dust into constellations drifting through domestic space. Here, in this unremarkable corner of an unremarkable house, a man who had rewritten the laws of the cosmos would perform his most human ritual. The closing of eyes, the surrender to stillness, the deliberate descent into the country that exists between waking and the vast unknown. Albert Einstein did not sleep by accident. He slept as priests pray at appointed hours, with intention, as though answering a summons from something older than thought itself. The world knew him as the mind that bent time, that proved simultaneity was illusion, that showed how space curved beneath the weight of matter. Photographers captured him in wire-rimmed spectacles, wild-haired and penetrating, staring into distances no lens could measure. Students spoke of his brilliance in hushed tones. Colleagues debated his theories with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. But what they did not photograph, what they rarely witnessed, was this. Each afternoon, somewhere near 2 o'clock, Einstein would set down his pen mid-equation, remove those famous spectacles, and allow his head to settle against the worn leather of his chair. His breathing would slow. The furrows in his brow would soften. And for exactly 15 minutes, no more, no less, he would disappear into a darkness that even his equations could not illuminate. Some believe this was merely rest. A brief respite from mental exhaustion. A practical solution to the fatigue that comes from holding too many abstractions simultaneously in mind. But those who knew him, who glimpsed him in these moments of surrender, sensed something deeper. The way he positioned the chair always facing the window. The way he would not allow interruption during this hour. The way he emerged from these brief descents with a clarity that seemed almost otherworldly, as though he had traveled somewhere and returned bearing invisible gifts. Whispers tell us that Einstein understood what mystics have always known, that the mind, for all its power, requires periodic dissolution. That insight arrives not through relentless pursuit, but through the courage to stop pursuing. That sometimes the gates to understanding open only when we cease our knocking and simply stand in the silence, waiting. The chair itself was unremarkable cracked leather, stuffing emerging from one corner, the kind of furniture that appears in estate sales and is purchased for its comfort rather than its beauty. Yet in Einstein's study, it became something else entirely. Throne and altar, launch pad and landing site. The physical point where the man who conquered relativity bowed daily to the body's ancient rhythms, acknowledging a truth more fundamental than any mathematical proof. That flesh has its own wisdom, its own non-negotiable demands. Beneath the silence of those afternoon hours lived a profound contradiction. Here was a man who proved that time could stretch and compress, that duration was relative, that two observers moving at different speeds would experience the same moment differently. His theories dismantled our common-sense understanding of reality itself. Yet his own body insisted on its archaic schedule, as predictable as the tides, as regular as planetary motion. At 2 o'clock, fatigue would arrive. At 2:15 he would wake. No theory could alter this. No equation could negotiate different terms. Perhaps this was mercy. Perhaps the universe, in its infinite subtlety, granted him one small mystery he could not solve, the mystery of his own need for rest. The puzzle of why 15 minutes restored what 16 hours of waking depleted. Or perhaps it was lesson, that some truths resist abstraction, that the deepest knowledge lives in the body's instinctive wisdom, in rhythms inherited from ancestors who slept and woke according to the sun's patient geometry. The afternoon light that found him daily carried its own significance. Not morning light, sharp and insistent, demanding productivity. Not evening light, heavy with the day's accumulation. But afternoon light golden, slanted, already beginning its long goodbye. This was light that knew about endings. Light that understood the necessity of decline, of letting go, of the slow spiral back toward darkness. It fell across his face like a benediction, turning his lined skin to parchment, transforming his closed eyelids into something ancient and sacred, sealed gates behind which secrets moved. What happened in those 15 minutes? What country did he visit? What language did his sleeping mind speak that his waking mind could never quite translate? We know only fragments. That sometimes he would wake with tears on his face, unable to explain their source. That occasionally a mathematical problem that had resisted weeks of conscious effort would present its solution fully formed upon waking, as though some deeper intelligence had been working all along in the darkness. That he described the nap not as escape from thought, but as a different kind of thinking, older, slower, operating by rules that predated language. The dust particles that drifted through the window light became, in those moments, more than dust. They were the visible manifestation of time itself, tiny fragments of matter moving through space according to laws both physical and mysterious. Einstein would have known their precise behavior, Brownian motion, random walks, the statistical mechanics of microscopic collisions. But watching them drift in the afternoon sun, half asleep in his chair, perhaps he saw something else entirely. Perhaps he saw what the ancients saw when they watched dust spiral through temple light, evidence of the invisible breath that moves through all things, proof that even stillness contains motion. That rest is not absence but presence of a different order. The chair held him like a stone vessel holds water perfectly, without question, shaped by years of use to the exact contours of his form. His head would tilt to the left, finding the spot worn smooth by countless previous descents. His hands would rest on the armrests, palms open, fingers slightly curled, as though releasing something too heavy to carry any longer. His breathing would shift from the shallow rhythm of concentration to the deeper tides of sleep, each exhale a small surrender, each inhale a return to the shore of consciousness. And in that rhythmic breathing, in that regular rise and fall, lived something that no equation could capture. The pure fact of being alive, of existing as matter that thinks and matter that rests, intelligence incarnate in a body that insists on its animal needs, even as the mind reaches for celestial truths. Marked by the moon of the clock's slow hand, 15 minutes would pass. Sometimes he would dream fragmentary visions that dissolved upon waking like frost in morning sun. Sometimes he would simply drift in the vast emptiness between thoughts, that oceanic darkness where the self temporarily releases its boundaries and becomes, briefly, indistinguishable from the void it floats within. And always at the appointed moment his eyes would open again. The light would have shifted slightly. The dust would still be drifting. The equations would be waiting on his desk, patient as always, ready to resume their dance. But something would have changed. Some knot would have loosened. Some gate would have opened that had been closed before. He would rise from the chair, replace his spectacles, return to his work. The world outside would never know where he had been, what silent pilgrimage he had completed in that worn leather vessel, what darkness he had visited and returned from bearing its subtle gifts. Her memory fades and documentation fails. We are left with this image. An old man in an old chair, afternoon light turning dust to starlight. 15 minutes carved from the relentless forward march of time. A man who proved time was not what we thought it was. Yet who could not escape its most ancient mystery? The mystery of the body's need to cease, to pause, to drift for a while in that borderless country where thought dissolves and something older, something that knows no equations, rises to meet the light. Perhaps the afternoon itself held eternity. Perhaps those 15 minutes contained more time than all his theories could measure. Perhaps in surrendering to sleep, he touched something that all his waking brilliance could only circle but never quite reach, the simple, sacred truth that we are dust that thinks, starlight that wakes and sleeps, consciousness briefly borrowed from the universe and someday to be returned. But in the meantime, every afternoon, granted these small deaths and resurrections, these brief voyages into the unknown from which we emerge, again and again, mysteriously restored. The chair remains. The light still falls. And somewhere in the space between the equations on the page and the dreams behind closed eyes, Einstein's afternoon secret drifts like dust through sunbeams, visible but untouchable, real but inexplicable, waiting for those who have learned. As he learned, the profound art of closing one's eyes and trusting the darkness to be kind. There are rooms that hold more than furniture, more than books and papers and the accumulated debris of a life lived largely in the mind. There are rooms that become, over years of habitation, something closer to organisms breathing spaces that absorb the character of their occupant, that carry the residue of every thought conceived within their walls, every problem wrestled with, every mystery confronted and left, necessarily, unsolved. Einstein's study on Mercer Street was such a room. If you had entered it, and few did, during those sacred afternoon hours, you would have seen what appeared to be chaos. Papers scattered across every surface like fallen leaves after a storm. Books stacked in precarious towers that seemed to defy the very gravity their owner had spent decades trying to understand. A blackboard covered in symbols, some freshly chalked, others half erased by an absent hand, creating layers of thought visible all at once, like geological strata revealing different epochs of intellectual excavation. Chalk dust settled on everything. It hung in the air, visible in the slanted afternoon light, drifting down constantly like the slowest snow imaginable. It coated the windowsill, the desk, the arms of the leather chair. It gathered in Einstein's wild hair, dusted his shoulders, left ghost prints on every surface he touched. The room breathed chalk. The room exhaled mathematics. And yet, beneath the apparent disorder lived a different kind of order, not the order of filing systems or alphabetized shelves, but something deeper, more organic, a rhythm. A structure that existed not in space, but in time, not in the arrangement of objects, but in the ritual of daily surrender that took place here, in this chamber of unfinished thoughts, at the same hour each afternoon. It is said that Einstein could work for hours without pause, his pen moving across paper in that distinctive scrawl, equations flowing from some inexhaustible inner spring. Colleagues who visited would find him lost in concentration so complete that he seemed almost to have left his body behind, a ghost haunting his own flesh, present only in the abstract realm where symbols dance and space curves and time bends according to rules that common sense insists cannot possibly be true. But then, without warning, without any visible signal, something would shift. The pen would slow. Hover. Stop mid-symbol, suspended above the page as though the ink itself had grown too heavy to continue. His shoulders would sag slightly, just enough to be noticed by anyone paying close attention. His eyes, which moments before had been fierce with concentration, would lose their focus, gazing at the equation before him but no longer seeing it, seeing instead something else, something further away or deeper within the fatigue that lives in the bones of those who chase questions with no answers, who wrestle daily with problems that have no solutions, or solutions so strange that finding them feels less like discovery and more like madness. This was the moment. This was when the weight descended. Not inspiration, not breakthrough, but exhaustion, the kind that accumulates slowly over hours of holding impossibilities in mind, of forcing consciousness to bend in directions it was never designed to bend, of thinking thoughts so far removed from ordinary human experience that they exist almost as alien languages, requiring constant translation even within one's own skull. Some believe this exhaustion was merely physical. The natural fatigue of mental labor, no different in kind from the tiredness of someone who has spent hours lifting heavy stones. But those who knew Einstein, who worked beside him, who glimpsed him in these moments before he surrendered to sleep, sensed something else. Something that went beyond simple tiredness into territory more mysterious, more ancient. There is an exhaustion that comes from seeing too much, from understanding connections that others cannot see, from carrying truths too strange to share with anyone who has not also stared into the same mathematical abyss and felt it stare back. This was the weight that descended on Einstein in his study, in the midst of his sacred disorder, when the equations would not resolve, and the universe would not yield its secrets, and even his formidable mind had to admit, at least temporarily, defeat. And this was when he would rise from his desk. He would set down the pen with deliberate care, as though it were not merely a writing instrument but a tool of almost sacred significance, which, in a sense, it was. He would remove his spectacles, folding them slowly, placing them beside the unfinished equation. He would turn from the blackboard where symbols hung suspended, waiting, patient as stars, for his return. And he would cross the few steps to his chair by the window, that worn leather throne we have already met, positioned always in the same place, angled to catch the same afternoon light. The chair knew him, knew the exact shape of his body, the precise curve of his spine, the weight of his head as it settled against the cushion. How many hours had it held him? How many afternoons had witnessed this same ritual of surrender? The leather bore the marks of his presence, cracks where his weight had pressed repeatedly, smooth patches where his hands had gripped the armrests, a depression shaped perfectly to cradle a head weary from too much thinking. He would sit. The papers would still be scattered behind him, equations still unfinished, problems still unsolved. But he would turn his back on them deliberately, as a pilgrim turns from the world when entering a temple. His breathing would begin to slow. His eyelids would grow heavy. The chalk dust would continue its eternal drift through the golden light, and he would watch it for a moment, or perhaps he wouldn't. Perhaps his eyes had already closed, and then he would slip away. 15 minutes. In that quarter hour, the study would remain exactly as he left it. The papers would not rearrange themselves. The equations would not solve themselves. The blackboard would stand mute, its symbols frozen, waiting. And yet something would change, something invisible but undeniable. As though the room itself used this time differently than Einstein did, as though the space needed its own kind of rest, its own opportunity to integrate what had been poured into it during those hours of fierce concentration. Where does thought go when the thinker stops thinking? Does it simply cease, like a candle flame snuffed out? Or does it continue somehow, in some other register, below the threshold of consciousness, working in darkness on problems that resist the light? Beneath the silence of Einstein's sleeping breath, the study held its mysteries. Papers that seemed scattered randomly might, to Einstein's eye upon waking, reveal patterns not visible before. Equations that had resisted all his conscious efforts might suddenly present their solutions, not because anything had changed on the page, but because something had shifted in his perception. Some knot had untied, some gate had opened, some clarity had arrived from wherever clarity comes from. His colleagues spoke, sometimes, visiting Einstein after his afternoon nap and finding him transformed. Not dramatically, he did not wake speaking in tongues or proclaiming grand revelations, but subtly, a brightness in his eyes that had not been there before, a readiness to return to problems that had seemed, just an hour earlier, insurmountable, a quality of presence that suggested he had traveled somewhere and returned bearing invisible gifts. What happened in that darkness? What alchemy took place while he slept? Some believe the sleep itself was the answer, that the brain, given permission to rest, would consolidate memories, process information, make connections impossible during waking hours. Modern neuroscience speaks of this now with increasing confidence, mapping the ways that sleep reorganizes knowledge, strengthens memory, allows insights to emerge from the chaos of accumulated data. But Einstein knew this decades before any brain scan confirmed it. He knew it the way sailors know storms are coming, through attention to subtle signs, through respect for forces larger than individual will, through the hard-won understanding that sometimes the most productive thing one can do is stop being productive. He treated his afternoon nap not as interruption, but as methodology, not as weakness, but as tool, as crucial to his work as his blackboard, his pen, his chalk. He built it into his daily architecture with the same deliberation he brought to his equations, recognizing that the mind, like any instrument, requires maintenance, requires periods of rest and restoration, requires the courage to cease its laboring and trust that something else, something operating below consciousness, will continue the work in ways the waking mind cannot. The study became, in this way, a chamber of transformation, a space where the impossible remained impossible during waking hours, but somehow became thinkable during sleep, where problems that had no solutions would wait patiently for Einstein to close his eyes, and then through processes that remain mysterious even now, would offer up their secrets in the moments of his waking, or perhaps not in the sleep itself, but in the space between. That threshold state where he was neither fully asleep nor fully awake. Where the study would come back into focus gradually, the chalk dust still drifting, the papers still scattered, the equations still waiting, but everything somehow different, softer, more permeable, as though the boundaries between self and problem had thinned during his brief absence, allowing a kind of osmosis to occur, a mingling that conscious effort always prevented. Marked by the moon path of dust through afternoon light, 15 minutes would pass. The shadows in the study would shift by degrees imperceptible to anyone watching, yet measurable by instruments precise enough to capture such subtleties. The temperature would drop slightly as the sun's angle changed. The quality of light would transform from gold to amber, from amber to something closer to honey. And Einstein would wake. His eyes would open. The study would reassemble itself around him, the familiar chaos, the waiting problems, the unfinished thoughts that had driven him to rest. But he would return to them differently, not with the same fierce concentration that had exhausted him, but with something quieter, something that knew now that some problems solve themselves if you give them time and space and the gift of your temporary absence. The pen would be picked up again. The spectacles would return to their perch on his nose. The symbols on the blackboard would receive his attention once more. But the man approaching them would not be quite the same man who had turned away. Something had shifted. Some transformation had occurred in that sacred disorder, in that chamber where thoughts went to rest and somehow, mysteriously, to ripen? Did solutions come in dreams, or in the space between sleep and waking? Did the darkness hold answers, or did it simply hold him gently enough that answers could approach without frightening him with their strangeness? Perhaps these are questions that cannot be answered. Perhaps they live, permanently, in the same realm as the unfinished equations on Einstein's blackboard, present, visible, tantalizing, but ultimately resistant to the kind of resolution that fully satisfies. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Some transformations are meant to occur in darkness, where light cannot follow and consciousness cannot observe. The study holds these secrets still. The chair remembers. The dust continues its eternal drift. And somewhere in the space between scattered papers and ordered ritual, between chaos and surrender, between waking effort and sleeping grace, Einstein discovered what mystics have always known: that sometimes the only way forward is to stop moving. The only way to solve the problem is to stop solving. The only way to find what you're seeking is to close your eyes and trust the darkness to be kind. He proved it could bend, stretch, compress beneath the weight of gravity. He showed that two observers, moving at different speeds through space, would experience the same moment differently. 1 second could be another's hour, one's hour another's lifetime. He demonstrated that simultaneity was illusion, that now had no absolute meaning, that past and future were not fixed categories but fluid relationships dependent on velocity and position. He conquered time, rewrote its rules, revealed it as something stranger and more beautiful than anyone had imagined. And yet, each afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, fatigue would arrive like clockwork. Not approximately 2, not around that time, give or take, but 2 o'clock as predictable as the tides, as regular as planetary motion, as reliable as any physical law he'd ever discovered. His body, which housed the mind that had bent the universe's most fundamental dimension, remained stubbornly, almost comically, subject to rhythms older than thought itself. The irony was not lost on him. It is said that Einstein had a complicated relationship with clocks. He kept them in his study, of course multiple timepieces scattered among the papers and books, each one showing slightly different times, as though even these instruments could not quite agree on what now meant. Some ran fast. Some ran slow. Some he never bothered to wind, letting them freeze at random hours, their hands pointing to moments that no longer existed or had not yet arrived, depending on your frame of reference. But his body needed no clock, carried its own timekeeper, one that could not be rewound or reset or theorized away. 2 o'clock would come, and with it the undeniable weight, the heaviness in his limbs, the fog settling over his thoughts. The body's ancient insistence, rest now or suffer the consequences. He could have fought it, could have pushed through with coffee or force of will, the way so many do, treating the body's needs as inconveniences to be overcome rather than wisdom to be honored. But Einstein, who had spent his life questioning assumptions, who had built his revolutionary theories by asking what everyone else took for granted, applied that same questioning to his own fatigue. Why did tiredness arrive at the same hour each day? What evolutionary logic lay beneath this circadian rhythm? What would happen if he surrendered to it rather than resisting? And so began the experiment that would last the rest of his life. The daily ritual of afternoon sleep, scheduled not by choice but by biology, governed not by the flexible time of his equations, but by the absolute time of blood and bone and neural firing patterns that had evolved over millions of years, long before any ape stood upright and wondered about the stars. Beneath the silence of his study, as he settled into his chair each afternoon, lived this profound paradox. The man who proved time was relative could not escape the fact that his body experienced time absolutely. The physiologists clocked the circadian rhythm, the homeostatic pressure for sleep, the ultradian cycles of energy and exhaustion. These obeyed no theory of relativity. They ran on their own time, and that time was not negotiable. Some believed this contradiction troubled him. That it rankled, somehow, to be so thoroughly subject to physical laws of his own being while having transcended the physical laws of the cosmos. But those who knew him suggest otherwise. They speak of Einstein's deep humility in the face of the body's wisdom, his recognition that consciousness, for all its power, remained embodied, not trapped in flesh, exactly, but expressed through it, dependent on it, constrained by its requirements in ways that no amount of theoretical brilliance could overcome. He wrote once, in a letter to a friend struggling with insomnia, "The body knows things the mind cannot calculate. Perhaps that is its gift, to remind us that we are not only thoughts, but also breath and blood, and the need sometimes to simply stop." Where does time live? In Einstein's equations, it lives as a dimension, as a coordinate, as something that can be mapped and measured and shown to curve and dilate under the right conditions. But in the body, time lives differently, as rhythm, as cycle, as the inevitable alternation between waking and sleep, energy and exhaustion, the need to act and the need to cease acting. The body's time is ancient time, evolutionary time, time that learned its patterns before brains grew large enough to question them, before consciousness arose to make the mistake of thinking it could override biology with will alone. This is the time that tells migrating birds when to fly south, that tells bears when to hibernate, that told Einstein's nervous system, every single day at 2 o'clock, that the time for thinking had ended and the time for resting had arrived. And he could not bend it, could not stretch it, could not prove it relative. His pocket watch, the one he carried always, the one that appears in so many photographs, ticked away its seconds with mechanical precision. But what did those seconds mean? According to his own theories, the watch's time was not absolute. An observer moving at different speeds would measure those same seconds as longer or shorter. Time itself was not a fixed river carrying everyone along at the same rate, but a landscape whose contours changed depending on where you stood and how fast you moved. Yet the watch's time was absolute enough for fatigue, absolute enough for the body's demands. At 2 o'clock, not 1:47 or 2:13, but 2 o'clock, the sleepiness would descend. The equations would blur. The brilliant mind would feel its own limitations pressing in like walls closing slowly on a room that had seemed, just moments before, infinitely spacious. This was the clock that could not hold him, in the sense that his theories had escaped it, had shown its rules to be local rather than universal, contingent rather than absolute. But it was also the clock that held him absolutely, in the sense that his body obeyed it with a fidelity no equation could match. Marked by this daily return to embodiment, Einstein's life became a kind of proof, not mathematical, but existential. A proof that genius lives in flesh. That insight arises from neurons that need glucose and oxygen and rest. That the mind that can grasp the infinite is itself finite, bound by requirements that preceded understanding and will outlast it. Some afternoons he would sit in his chair before the fatigue arrived, as though trying to get ahead of it, to claim his rest voluntarily rather than being forced to it by exhaustion. But the body knew, always knew. At 2 o'clock, whether he was in his study or at a lecture, whether he'd slept well the night before or poorly, the signal would come. Clear, undeniable, non-negotiable. And in that signal lived a kind of wisdom that his theories could describe but never fully contain. The wisdom that says, you are not only mind, you are also matter. And matter has its rhythms, its needs, its own intelligence that operates below the level of conscious choice. He could theorize about time dilation, but he could not dilate his own circadian cycle. He could prove that simultaneity was relative, but his 2 o'clock was always his 2 o'clock, no matter how fast he moved or how strong his gravitational field. He could show that past and future were part of a four-dimensional spacetime block where all moments existed equally, but his body insisted on living through time sequentially, moment by moment, with fatigue building and release coming only through the ritual of afternoon sleep. Perhaps this is why he never fought it, why he built his life around this non-negotiable fact rather than struggling against it. He understood, better than most, that some laws are more fundamental than others. That the law of fatigue preceded the law of relativity by billions of years. That biology's clock, for all its lack of sophistication, for all its seeming crudeness compared to the elegant mathematics of spacetime geometry, was in its own way more powerful because it operated whether he understood it or not, whether he consented to it or not. The afternoon would come. 2 o'clock would arrive. And Einstein, who had rewritten the physics of time itself, would surrender to time's oldest rhythm. There is something almost holy in this surrender, something that speaks to a truth deeper than any equation can express, that we are not separate from the universe we study, that the observer is part of what is observed, that consciousness, for all its apparent transcendence, remains rooted in the biological, the chemical, the physical processes that sustain it. His theories showed that time is not what we thought it was, but his daily nap showed that time, whatever it truly is, has power over us. That we live within its strange geometry, not as abstract observers, but as embodied participants. That the mind that can imagine escaping gravity cannot escape the gravity of its own exhaustion. Perhaps that was the final lesson, the one that came not from calculation, but from experience, not from theory, but from the simple repetition of closing one's eyes each afternoon and feeling the world soften, blur, recede. A lesson that said, you have discovered how time works in the cosmos, but you cannot escape how time works in you. You have shown that clocks can run at different speeds, but your body's clock keeps its own time, older and more insistent than any theory. And in that paradox, the cosmic clockmaker subject to biological clockwork, the master of time remaining time's servant lived a kind of poetry. A reminder that genius, for all its grandeur, still needs what the simplest organism needs: rest. Rhythm, the mercy of periodic darkness, the gift of stopping. The clock that could not hold him had held him all along, not as prison but as home, not as limitation but as truth. And 15 minutes after each 2 o'clock, when his eyes would open again, and the equations would be waiting and time would resume its forward flow, he would carry with him this knowledge, that some mysteries remain forever beyond solving, and the deepest one might be the mystery of existing as consciousness incarnate, thought made flesh, infinity housed in the finite vessel of a body that knows, better than any theory ever could, when it is time to rest. There are languages older than words, older than mathematics, even though mathematics claims to be the universe's native tongue. There are ways of knowing that bypass conscious thought entirely, that arrive not through logic or deduction, but through the strange grammar of symbols that appear behind closed eyelids. In that country we visit nightly, but can never quite remember upon return. What moved through the darkness when Einstein slept? What visions crossed the threshold of those 15 minutes? Leaving traces so faint that even he who could hold the architecture of spacetime in his mind with perfect clarity could barely describe what he had witnessed. It is said that he kept no dream journal. left no systematic record of what occurred during those afternoon descents into sleep. This is strange, in a way, for a man who documented everything else, every equation, every insight, every step along the path toward his revolutionary understanding of reality. Yet the dreams remained mostly unrecorded, mentioned only in passing, hinted at in fragments scattered across decades of correspondence. A line in a letter to a colleague. Had the most peculiar vision upon waking today. Geometric forms that seemed to breathe, to pulse with some kind of interior light. Cannot explain it properly. A margin note in a notebook, written in that distinctive scrawl beside an equation he'd been wrestling with for weeks. Solution came in afternoon sleep. Numbers singing their relationships, woke knowing though cannot say how. A mention, years later, to a friend visiting from Europe. Sometimes I wake from my nap with tears on my face. No idea why. No memory of sadness. Just tears as though I've witnessed something beautiful and unbearable. These fragments are all we have. Breadcrumbs leading into a forest we cannot enter. Glimpses through a doorway that closed the moment he opened his eyes. But what glimpses they are. Beneath the silence of those recorded moments lies the suggestion of something extraordinary, a kind of knowing that operated outside the rules of conscious thought, that spoke in the primal vocabulary of shape and pattern, of relationship and resonance, of connections felt rather than calculated. Geometric shapes that breathed. Try to imagine that for a moment. Not static forms, not the lifeless triangles and circles of textbook geometry, but shapes alive with some quality we have no name for. Expanding and contracting like lungs, pulsing like hearts, moving through spaces that had more dimensions than the three we navigate in waking life, obeying laws that made perfect sense in the dream, but dissolved into impossibility upon waking. Einstein, who spent his waking hours wrestling with the geometry of curved spacetime, who proved that space itself could bend and warp and stretch, dreaming of geometries even stranger than those his equations described. Did these dream shapes teach him something? Did they show him truths his conscious mind had not yet grasped? Or were they simply his exhausted brain processing the day's mathematical labor, creating visual metaphors for relationships too abstract to think about directly, numbers that sang? This phrase appears more than once in the fragments we have, not metaphorically, not as poetic license, but as description of actual experience. He heard numbers, heard their relationships to one another expressed not as equations but as harmonies, as chords, as music that existed somewhere beyond sound, in some register that only the sleeping mind could perceive. Pythagoras would have understood. The ancient philosopher who heard music in mathematical ratios, who believed the planets sang as they moved, who knew that number and harmony were not separate things, but different expressions of the same underlying reality. Einstein, separated from Pythagoras by 25 centuries, dreaming the same ancient truth, that mathematics is not just visual or logical but sonic, musical, a symphony playing eternally in the structure of existence itself. Some believe these were not true dreams at all. Not the random firings of a resting brain, not the chaotic replay of the day's accumulated impressions, but something else entirely. Something that occurred in that peculiar threshold, state between sleep and waking, in those moments when consciousness has not quite departed, but has loosened its grip enough for something older to emerge. Where does the self go when we sleep? Modern neuroscience speaks of altered brain states, of different patterns of neural firing, of the selective deactivation of certain regions while others remain active. But these descriptions, precise as they are, somehow miss the essential mystery. They tell us what happens in the brain, but not what happens to the experience of being, to the sense of I that seems so solid in waking life, but dissolves so completely in sleep. Einstein's nap dreams, lasting only 15 minutes, were too brief for the deep sleep where most vivid dreaming occurs. Yet they were long enough for something. Long enough for consciousness to shift, to loosen, to become permeable in ways that waking thought never allows. Long enough for the boundary between self and universe to grow thin, for the distinction between observer and observed to blur, for some kind of communion to occur that left traces even when the specific content was forgotten. He woke once with tears streaming down his face. This detail appears in a letter written late in his life, a reflective piece where he's looking back across decades of work, of insight, of struggle. The tears puzzled him. He had no memory of sadness, no recollection of what he'd been dreaming about. Just the physical fact of crying, evidence of some emotional experience so powerful it had crossed the threshold from sleep into waking, leaving its mark on his body, even though his mind retained no conscious memory. What could move a man who had witnessed the secrets of the cosmos to tears? What vision could penetrate so deeply that it bypassed memory entirely, speaking directly to some part of him that existed below language, below thought, below even the possibility of articulation? Perhaps he had glimpsed something too vast for consciousness to hold. Perhaps he had seen, for just a moment, the totality of things not as equations but as living presence, not as abstract truth but as immediate reality. Perhaps he had felt, rather than understood, the staggering beauty of existence, the impossible fact that anything exists at all, let alone exists in such ordered complexity, such mathematical elegance. Or perhaps the tears came from loss. From the knowledge, held briefly in sleep, that would evaporate upon waking. From the experience of understanding something completely, perfectly, in the dream, only to feel it slip away the moment his eyes opened, leaving behind nothing but the ache of its absence. Marked by these fragments, these hints, these glimpses through the veil, we are left to wonder what other dreams went unrecorded. What other visions moved through those afternoon sleeps that he never mentioned to anyone, never wrote down, never translated into the language of waking life? There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not about Einstein as a young man dreaming of riding a beam of light, traveling at the speed of light through the universe, and waking with the insight that would eventually become special relativity. Whether this actually happened or became embellished over time, we cannot know. But it carries the flavor of truth, the sense that Einstein's great insights came not only through conscious calculation, but through some deeper intuition, some way of knowing that operated below or beyond the rational mind. His afternoon naps, years later, may have been his way of returning to that source, of creating, deliberately, the conditions under which such insights could arrive. Not chasing them directly that never worked, but creating the space, the openness, the receptivity that would allow them to approach. Solutions appearing fully formed upon waking. This happened more than once. He would struggle with a problem for days, weeks, approaching it from every angle, trying every mathematical tool he possessed and finding only dead ends. Exhausted, he would surrender to his afternoon ritual, close his eyes, drift away, and then wake, sometimes within seconds of opening his eyes, knowing the answer, not having to work it out, not having to derive it step by step. Just knowing, the way we know our own names, the way we know which direction is up. Where did these solutions come from? His unconscious mind, working on the problem even while he slept. Some deeper intelligence that exists below the threshold of awareness. Or something else entirely, some connection to a realm of mathematical truth that exists independently of any individual mind, accessible only to those who learn the art of getting out of their own way. The mystics speak of this, of surrendering the small self to access something larger, of ceasing to grasp in order to receive, of the paradox that seeking prevents finding. That effort obscures what effortlessness reveals. Einstein, who was never particularly mystical in his waking life, who maintained a healthy skepticism about supernatural claims, nevertheless discovered through practice what the mystics describe through poetry, that sometimes the only way to solve the problem is to stop trying to solve it. His dreams spoke in symbols because symbols are the language of the space between waking and sleeping, between knowing and not knowing, between self and cosmos. They showed him shapes that breathed because the universe itself breathes, expanding and contracting in cycles so vast they make our lifetimes seem like single heartbeats. They sang to him in numbers because mathematics is not invention but discovery, not something we create but something we overhear, eavesdropping on the universe's eternal song. And when he woke, most of it would vanish. The specific images would dissolve like frost in morning sun. The feeling would fade. The certainty would become uncertain again, but something would remain, some residue. Some gift brought back from that other country, that realm where the boundary between observer and observed grows thin enough to cross. Perhaps that is why he kept no dream journal. Perhaps these experiences were too fragile for documentation, too subtle for language, too intimate for sharing. Perhaps he understood that some truths can only be lived, never described. That the moment you try to capture them in words, they escape, leaving behind only their shadow, their echo, their ghost. So we are left with fragments, with hints, with the tantalizing suggestion that Einstein's 15-minute naps were not merely rest, but doorways, not merely recovery, but revelation, not merely sleep, but pilgrimage into territories his waking mind could visit only through surrender. The dreams spoke in symbols. And he listened, as best he could, to a language that had no dictionary, no grammar, no rules except the ancient rule of receptivity. That to hear what the darkness whispers, one must first be willing to close one's eyes and trust that what speaks there speaks truth, even when waking cannot verify it, even when consciousness cannot quite remember it, even when all that remains is tears on a face and wonder in a heart, and the certainty, fading even as it's noticed, that for just a moment, 15 minutes, no more, no less, the veil between knower and known had lifted, and something eternal had touched something human. And the meeting had been too beautiful for words. There is a grammar to surrender, a syntax of release, small gestures repeated daily that over time become more than habit. They become ceremony, architecture, the physical language through which the soul prepares itself for passage between worlds. Einstein's ritual began the same way every afternoon. First, the pen, not dropped carelessly, not tossed aside in frustration or triumph, but set down with deliberate care. Placed precisely on the desk, parallel to the page it had just been filling, cap replaced if it had been removed, positioned just so. This was not fastidiousness. This was acknowledgement. The pen had done its work. The pen would rest, and so would he. Then the spectacles, those wire-rimmed glasses that had become as iconic as his wild hair, as recognizable as his face itself. He would remove them slowly, fold them with both hands, set them beside the pen. The world would blur slightly. The equations on the page before him, which moments ago had been sharp and demanding, would soften into gentle abstractions. Already, he was beginning to leave. Already, the boundary was forming between the man who calculated and the man who would, for 15 minutes, cease all calculating. Finally, the notebook. If it was open, he would close it. Not slam it shut, but close it gently, as one closes a door on a sleeping child with care, with tenderness, with the understanding that what lies beyond that door is precious and should not be disturbed. The notebook held his thoughts, his efforts, his wrestling with the infinite. And now, for a while, those thoughts would have to wait. These gestures, pen, glasses, notebook, formed a kind of choreography. A dance performed alone, for an audience of one, in the privacy of a study where afternoon light fell like blessing through the window. Each movement mattered. Each small act served as threshold, as marker, as the visible manifestation of an invisible boundary being drawn between two states of being. It is said that ritual is how we make meaning from repetition, that by doing the same thing the same way, again and again, we transform mere habit into something approaching sacred. The first time Einstein set down his pen and removed his glasses and closed his notebook before sleeping, it was perhaps nothing more than practical necessity. But the 100th time, the 1000th, by then, these gestures had accumulated layers of significance invisible to any observer, comprehensible only to the one performing them. This was not accident. This was architecture. Einstein treated his afternoon nap the way a master builder treats a cathedral, as something requiring deliberate design, careful construction, absolute respect for the integrity of its structure. He understood, perhaps better than most, that the mind cannot simply switch off like a lamp. That consciousness requires preparation for its own temporary dissolution. That the transition from waking to sleeping is itself a kind of journey, and like all journeys, it begins with departure, with the ritual of leaving one place to travel to another. The pen set down meant, I am no longer reaching for truth through calculation. The glasses removed meant, I am no longer looking outward at equations but inward at darkness. The notebook closed meant, I release my grip on what I have been holding. I let go. And letting go, he understood, was not passive but active. Not defeat but discipline. Not weakness but the highest form of strength, the strength to cease, to stop, to turn away from the endless hunt and simply be still. Beneath the silence of these preparations lived another layer of ritual, the protection of boundaries. Einstein's afternoon nap was not a secret exactly, but it was guarded. His colleagues learned, early and definitively, not to disturb him during this hour. His secretary, Helen Dukas, became the gatekeeper of his rest, turning away visitors with polite but firm apologies. Professor Einstein is not available between 2 and 3 o'clock. No exceptions, no emergencies, no compromises. This protection was gift and necessity both. Gift because it honored the profound importance of what he was doing, not merely sleeping, but engaging in a practice essential to his ability to think at all. Necessity because the world, if allowed, would have consumed him entirely. Letters arrived daily by the dozens. Visitors appeared unannounced, seeking audience with the famous mind. Institutions requested his time, his input, his blessing. Everyone wanted something from Einstein, but during that hour, that single hour each afternoon, he belonged to no one, not to Princeton, not to physics. Not to the students who revered him or the colleagues who needed him or the world that had made him into more than a man, into a symbol, an icon, a representation of genius itself. During that hour, he belonged only to himself, to the silence, to the mercy of emptiness that asks nothing, demands nothing, expects nothing but presence. Some believe this was selfish. That a mind so brilliant, so capable, so rare, had an obligation to share itself constantly, to never rest when there were still problems unsolved, still mysteries unraveled, still truths waiting to be discovered. But those who loved him understood differently. They saw what the world's demands were doing to him. They recognized that without this protected hour, without this daily return to himself, there would be nothing left to share. The well would run dry. The fire would consume its own fuel and gutter out. Helen Dukas understood. She stood at the threshold of his study like a guardian at a temple gate, turning away the well-meaning and the desperate alike. "He is resting," she would say, and in those 3 words lived a whole philosophy. That rest is not optional, that genius requires its own maintenance, that the mind stretched thin across the cosmos must periodically contract back into itself or risk tearing apart entirely. His colleagues understood. They learned to schedule their meetings around this sacred hour, to approach him before 2 or wait until after 3, to respect the rhythm that sustained him even when they could not quite comprehend its necessity. Some of them, the wisest ones, began to adopt similar practices themselves, carving out their own protected hours, their own rituals of release, learning from Einstein's example that productivity is not constant output, but rhythmic alternation between exertion and rest. Where does wisdom come from? Sometimes from books, sometimes from experience, sometimes from the simple act of paying attention to what works, what sustains, what allows the impossible to become possible. Einstein paid attention. He noticed that 15 minutes of afternoon sleep restored him in ways that no amount of coffee or willpower could match. He noticed that problems which seemed intractable at 1:45 would sometimes yield their secrets at 2:20, after he'd closed his eyes and drifted away and returned. He noticed that his mind operated differently, better, more freely when it was granted this regular reprieve from its own intensity. And so he built his life around this knowing, made it non-negotiable, protected it fiercely. Not because he was lazy or weak or unable to push through fatigue like others did, but because he understood something most people miss, that the most productive thing one can do is sometimes to do nothing at all. But why 15 minutes? This question haunted even those closest to him. Not 10, not 20, but 15 exactly. As though his body possessed some internal precision that knew, to the minute, the optimal duration for restoration without falling into deeper sleep from which waking would be difficult. What ancient wisdom told him this was the precise duration needed? Was it trial and error, gradual refinement over years of practice? Or did his body simply know, the way migrating birds know when to fly, the way trees know when to drop their leaves? Some knowledge lives deeper than conscious thought. Some rhythms are inherited rather than learned, carried in the blood and bones and neural architecture that evolution shaped over eons. 15 minutes was long enough to cross the threshold into sleep, long enough for consciousness to release its hold, for the thinking mind to grow quiet, for some other process mysterious, restorative to begin its work. But not so long that he would enter the deep sleep from which waking brings grogginess and disorientation. 15 minutes was the perfect duration for what sleep researchers now call a power nap, though Einstein practiced it decades before anyone thought to give it such a name. He had discovered, through attention and repetition, what science would later confirm. That brief sleep can clear the mind without the inertia that comes from longer rest. That there exists a sweet spot, a golden mean, where sleep is long enough to restore but not so long that it disrupts. 15 minutes was his sweet spot. His body knew it without being told. Marked by this precision, his ritual took on an almost mathematical elegance. The same gestures, the same duration, the same chair, same window, same light, variables eliminated, conditions optimized, everything designed to allow the maximum restoration in the minimum time. This was Einstein applying his genius not to the universe's laws, but to his own care, treating his need for rest with the same rigor he brought to his equations. And perhaps that was the deepest wisdom of all. That self-care, though he would never have used such modern language, was not separate from his work but foundational to it. That the ritual of letting go was not interruption but integration. That these small gestures, repeated daily, built the container strong enough to hold the immensity of what he was attempting to understand. The pen set down, the glasses removed, the notebook closed. Such simple acts, such ordinary moments. And yet, through repetition, through intention, through the alchemy of ritual, they became extraordinary. They became the architecture that held space for transformation. They became the gateway through which Einstein passed, daily, from the world that needed him to the silence that renewed him. In those 15 minutes, he belonged only to himself. And in belonging to himself, he found the strength to belong again to the world. To pick up the pen. To replace the glasses. To open the notebook and return to the endless, beautiful, exhausting hunt for truth. This was the ritual of letting go, not abandonment but trust, not escape but return, not ending but pause, the courage to stop when momentum urges continuation, the wisdom to close one's eyes when the world demands seeing, the faith that rest is not the opposite of productivity but its source. Einstein knew this, practiced this, protected this. And in protecting it, protected the mind that would change how we understand reality itself. The ritual remains. The wisdom endures. And somewhere in the space between pen set down and pen picked up again lives the eternal truth, that sometimes the most important thing we can do is nothing at all. In sleep, the body tells its oldest truth, that we are not masters of ourselves, but vessels through which life moves, breath flows, blood pulses according to rhythms older than thought, older than language, older than the very awareness that believes itself in control. When Einstein closed his eyes each afternoon, something happened that no equation could describe. His breathing would slow. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually the way tide recedes from shore, each wave pulling back a little further than the one before. The quick, shallow breath of concentration would deepen, lengthen, become oceanic. His chest would rise and fall with a rhythm that belonged not to thinking but to being, to the ancient machinery of lungs that have breathed since before we crawled from water, since before we stood upright and wondered about stars. 10 breaths per minute while he worked, then 8, then 6. Each breath slower, deeper, more complete. As though his body, released from the demands of consciousness, could finally remember how to breathe properly the way infants breathe, the way saints breathe in meditation, the way all living things breathe when thought is not interfering with the body's natural intelligence. And with the slowing of breath came the slowing of everything else. His heart, which had been beating faster during the hours of work, not frantically, but with the increased tempo that accompanies mental exertion, would settle into a deeper rhythm. 60 beats per minute, then 55, then 50. Each heartbeat more deliberate, more spacious, as though the muscle in his chest had been given permission to rest, to do only what was absolutely necessary and nothing more. It is said that those who witnessed Einstein sleeping spoke of a transformation, so complete it seemed almost magical. As though the man who closed his eyes was not quite the same being as the one who lay sleeping in the chair by the window. Helen Dukas, his secretary and guardian, saw him this way more than anyone. She would pass by the study during his afternoon rest, glancing through the doorway with the protective care of someone who has been entrusted with something precious. And what she saw always moved her in ways she struggled to articulate. The face that carried so much intensity while awake, the piercing eyes, the furrowed brow, the expression of someone perpetually wrestling with invisible forces would soften completely in sleep. The deep lines between his eyebrows, carved by decades of concentration, would smooth. The mouth, often pressed tight with determination, would relax into something approaching peace. His wild hair, which seemed to radiate energy even when he was still, would settle against the chair's headrest like grass lying down after wind has passed. "He looked young," she wrote once to a friend. Not young in years, but young in the way a soul looks when it has set down its burdens. As though decades had fallen away, and what remained was the child he once was, before all the equations, before all the fame, before the weight. Beneath the silence of sleep, beneath the visible transformation of relaxation, something else occurred. Something that witnesses sensed but could not quite name, a quality of vulnerability that seemed almost sacred, almost forbidden to observe. Elsa, his wife, understood this. She rarely entered the study during his afternoon rest, treating that hour as inviolate as any holy ground. But once, worried about a persistent cough he'd been fighting, she had looked in on him. Years later, speaking to a biographer, she tried to describe what she'd seen. "He was completely defenseless," she said. "That is the word that came to me, defenseless. This man who carried such vast knowledge, such power of mind in sleep, he was as vulnerable as any infant, his mouth slightly open, his hands uncurled, everything about him soft and unprotected. I felt I should not be seeing this, that I was witnessing something too private, too essential." This is the paradox of sleep, that it requires absolute vulnerability. The conscious mind, which guards and defends and maintains the boundaries of self, must dissolve. The body, which tenses against the world's demands, must release. Everything that says, "I am here, I am separate, I am strong," must surrender to the truth that we are, finally, only flesh mortal, fragile, completely at the mercy of forces beyond our control. For Einstein, whose mind could grasp the universe's deepest structures, this daily return to vulnerability was perhaps the most profound practice of all. An admission, renewed each afternoon, that genius lives in meat. That insight arises from neurons that can fail, from a heart that can stop, from lungs that require constant negotiation with air. That the self that seems so solid while awake is, in sleep, revealed as something more like mist, present but permeable, real but insubstantial, here but also somehow not quite here. Where does consciousness go when we sleep? This question haunted philosophers long before Einstein and continues to haunt neuroscientists today. We can map brain activity. We can measure which regions grow quiet and which remain active. We can track the stages of sleep, the cycles of REM and non-REM, the chemical cascades that accompany the descent into unconsciousness. But none of this answers the essential mystery. Where does the I go? The sense of being someone, of experiencing from a particular point of view what happens to that when sleep claims us. Some believe it simply dims, like turning down a light without extinguishing it completely. That consciousness remains present but muted, awareness continuing, but at a lower volume, the self still there but less defined, less insistent about its own existence. Others suggest it travels. That sleep opens doorways the waking mind cannot access, passages into territories that have no coordinates in ordinary space, that exist in some other dimension, entirely not the four dimensions of spacetime that Einstein mapped so brilliantly, but dimensions of a different order, accessible only through the dissolution of ordinary awareness. And still others propose that consciousness does not go anywhere at all, but that the question itself is wrong. That what we call consciousness is not a thing that can be located but a process, an activity, a particular pattern of organization that forms and dissolves and reforms, moment by moment, throughout our lives. That in sleep, the pattern loosens but does not disappear, the organization shifts but does not cease, and what we experience as unconsciousness is simply consciousness reorganizing itself in ways that leave no memory upon waking. Einstein himself wondered about this. Not professionally, it was not the kind of question his physics could address, but personally, privately, in the liminal moments between sleep and waking when such questions seem urgent and profound, before the full light of day renders them somehow less pressing. "I am here," he wrote once in a notebook, "and then I sleep, and then I am here again. But is it the same I that returns? Or is the self that wakes somehow different from the self that slept, changed by its passage through that darkness we cannot remember, marked by breath and heartbeat, measured in the slow rhythm of blood moving through vessels?" Einstein's 15-minute descents into sleep became, over years of practice, a kind of laboratory. Not for studying the physics of the external universe, but for experiencing directly the mystery of inner space, that vast territory of consciousness and unconsciousness, self and itself, being and temporary non-being that each of us navigates nightly but can never quite map. What happened in his body during those minutes was transformation of the most fundamental kind. Not the dramatic transformation of caterpillar to butterfly, but something subtler and perhaps more miraculous. The transformation of a person temporarily released from being a person. The organism called Einstein continuing its functions, breathing, circulating blood, maintaining temperature, processing nutrients, while the Einstein who calculated relativity and argued with quantum mechanics and pondered the unified field theory was simply absent. Present in body, but absent in the particular configuration of consciousness that made him him. And then, the return. Always, after exactly 15 minutes, his breathing would begin to quicken. Not all at once, but gradually, the way dawn comes so slowly at first that you cannot quite say when darkness ends and light begins. His heartbeat would accelerate slightly. The muscles of his face would tighten, almost imperceptibly, as though the mask of self was being carefully reconstructed, feature by feature, expression by expression. His eyelids would flutter. Behind them, rapid eye movements suggesting the return of awareness, consciousness swimming up from whatever depths it had explored, making its way back to the surface, to the light, to the familiar territory of waking life. And then his eyes would open. For just a moment, sometimes only a second, sometimes longer, there would be a quality of confusion in his gaze. Not the confusion of not knowing where he was, but something deeper. The confusion of remembering that he was, that this was his body, that this was his life, that he was Albert Einstein, physicist, thinker, the man who had equations waiting on the desk and problems to solve, and a world that needed him to be himself again. The transition from sleep to waking is not instantaneous, though it often feels that way in memory. There is a threshold, a borderland, a space between states where we are neither fully asleep nor fully awake, but suspended between worlds. Those who witnessed Einstein in these moments spoke of it with something approaching on the way his face would pass through expressions that seemed to belong to other lives, other selves, before settling finally into the familiar configuration they recognized. It was like watching someone being born, one colleague remarked after glimpsing Einstein waking from his afternoon rest. As though the self was being assembled from parts, constructed moment by moment, until finally it was complete and he was himself again. Perhaps that is what sleep does. Perhaps we die in small ways each time we close our eyes. The self dissolves, its careful construction coming apart, and for a while we are simply biological process, matter following its ancient instructions, life continuing without the organizing principle of I to give it meaning or direction. And then we wake, and the self reassembles, and we feel we are the same person who fell asleep, but are we? Or is continuity an illusion, memory playing tricks? The new self constructed each morning so similar to yesterday's self that we never notice the gap, never recognize that each awakening is, in its own way, a resurrection. Einstein's body knew what his mind could never quite prove. That consciousness is precious precisely because it is fragile, profound precisely because it is temporary, meaningful precisely because it can, at any moment, cease. That the silence between heartbeats is not empty, but full of the unknowing that makes knowing possible, full of the darkness that gives light its meaning, full of the death that makes life worth living. Each afternoon, for 15 minutes, Einstein surrendered to this truth, became nothing more than breath and heartbeat, became simply a body resting in a chair, vulnerable and undefended. The brilliant mind dissolved into neural patterns that had no particular identity, no special status, no fame or burden or weight. And then he returned, as we all return, the breath quickening, the heart resuming its waking rhythm, the face reconstructing its expression, the self reassembling from fragments of memory and habit, and the deep insistence that yes, I am here, I exist, I continue. But something had changed. Something always changed. The person who woke was not quite the person who slept. And in that difference, in that gap too small to measure but too real to deny, lived all the mystery of what it means to be conscious, to be alive, to be a mind that can grasp infinity but must regularly descend into darkness to continue grasping. The silence between heartbeats holds everything. And Einstein, in his wisdom, learned to listen. There are thresholds made of wood and glass, and thresholds made of consciousness. And sometimes, in the arrangement of a room where a man spent his afternoons drifting between waking and sleep, these two kinds of thresholds become one, the physical opening in the wall becoming also an opening in the soul, a place where inner and outer dissolve into each other, where the boundary between mind and cosmos grows so thin it might not exist at all. Einstein's armchair faced a window, always. Not by accident, not by default, but by deliberate choice repeated each time he moved, each time he rearranged his study, each time the furniture shifted for any reason. The chair would return to its position. The window would remain its constant companion. This was not negotiable. This was essential. Why? Those who asked received different answers depending on when they asked, how they asked, what mood found him. Sometimes he would say simply that he liked the light. Sometimes he would mention the view, the trees visible beyond the glass, the sky. Sometimes he would offer no explanation at all, only a slight smile that suggested the question missed the point entirely, that some truths cannot be spoken but only lived. But those who knew him best understood. The window was not decoration, not convenience. It was practice. It was philosophy made physical. It was Einstein's daily reminder that even as his equations mapped the universe's deepest structures, the immediate world remained as mysterious as it had been in childhood, as it would remain always. Through that window, the world performed its ancient show. Clouds drifted across the frame like thoughts across the mind, some dense and heavy, pregnant with rain, others wispy and insubstantial, hardly there at all. Birds crossed the visible sky, their trajectories following laws of aerodynamics that Einstein could have calculated, but chose instead simply to witness, to appreciate as pure motion, as grace. The seasons changed in that window like acts in a play that never ended, only cycled endlessly back to its beginning. Spring would arrive, and the trees visible through the glass would burst into green, that particular shade of new leaf that exists nowhere else in nature's palette. Summer would deepen that green into something richer, heavier, until the foliage seemed almost to press against the window, alive with insect hum and bird song, and the drowsy heat that makes even thought feel thick. Then autumn, Einstein's favorite. Some said when the leaves would transform into flames frozen in time, orange and yellow and red, brilliant against the blue sky, holding their color for weeks before finally releasing and drifting down like benediction. And winter, when the trees stood bare as bones, their branches making geometries against gray skies, patterns as complex and beautiful as any equation. It is said that Einstein would sometimes wake from his afternoon nap to find snow falling beyond the window. Silent snow, because the glass muted all sound, creating the illusion that the flakes descended without weight, without substance, pure pattern made visible by light. He would watch for a moment before fully returning to himself, suspended in that threshold state between sleep and complete waking, and the snow would seem not to fall but to float, as though gravity itself had taken a holiday, as though the laws he'd spent his life discovering had momentarily forgotten to apply. What did he see in those moments? What recognition passed between the man and the falling snow, between consciousness emerging from darkness and matter moving through space according to principles both physical and ineffable? Perhaps he saw himself, saw his own thoughts as snowflakes, each one unique, each one formed from the same basic substance, but arranged differently, each one falling according to laws both deterministic and random, both predictable and surprising. Perhaps he saw the universe's essential nature, that all of existence is matter in motion, following rules it did not choose, creating beauty it cannot comprehend. Or perhaps he saw nothing special at all. Perhaps it was simply snow falling beyond a window, observed by a man still half asleep, his mind not yet organized enough for metaphor or meaning. Perhaps the profundity lived not in what he saw, but in the fact that he had positioned himself to see it, that even in rest, even in the darkness of sleep, some part of him remained oriented toward the world, toward the light, toward the eternal show that continues whether or not anyone watches. Beneath the silence of those afternoon hours, the window served another function. It marked time's passage in ways no clock could match. Einstein might close his eyes when the light was golden, slanting through at that particular angle that said precisely 2 o'clock. And when he woke, 15 minutes later, the light would have shifted. Not dramatically, not from day to night, but perceptibly. The shadows would have moved. The angle would have changed. The quality of illumination would be somehow different, subtly altered, as though the world itself had breathed and in that breath had transformed. This was time made visible. Not the abstract time of his equations, not the mathematical construct that could dilate and compress, but lived time, biological time, the time that a body experiences as it moves through days and seasons and years. The window showed him this time, reminded him daily that he was not separate from the universe he studied, but embedded in it, subject to its rhythms, carried along by its ceaseless motion. Some believe Einstein's greatest insights came not from calculation, but from observation. From paying attention to simple phenomena with the kind of focus most people reserve for complex problems. As a child, he had been fascinated by a compass, the way its needle swung always toward north, responding to invisible forces, proving that empty space was not empty at all but filled with fields, with influence, with connection. That childhood wonder never left him. He carried it into adulthood, applied it to everything he witnessed. The window gave him endless material for wonder. Light bending as it passed through the glass. Shadows that weren't quite where geometry said they should be, because light doesn't travel in perfectly straight lines near matter. Raindrops on the windowpane creating tiny lenses that distorted the view beyond, making the familiar strange, making the ordinary extraordinary. He would notice these things in the moments after waking, when consciousness had returned, but habits of thought had not yet reassembled themselves. The world would appear fresh, unfiltered by expectation or theory, and he would really see the way light played on surfaces, the way drops of water held entire worlds upside down inside them, the way glass both separated and connected him to the space beyond. The window was threshold in both directions. It allowed him to look out, to maintain connection with the external world even while retreating into inner space. But it also, and this was crucial, it also prevented complete immersion in that external world. The glass was barrier as well as opening. It created the distance necessary for contemplation, for observation without being overwhelmed by participation. This is perhaps what Einstein understood most deeply, that to see clearly, one must maintain some separation. That total immersion destroys perspective. That the window, as metaphor and reality both, represents the optimal position for consciousness, neither completely isolated from the world nor completely dissolved into it, but poised at the boundary between inner and outer, self and cosmos, watching and being watched. Marked by the changing light, marked by seasons cycling through the same frame, marked by clouds and birds and snow and rain and sun, the window became Einstein's calendar, his clock, his connection to the eternal present that his theories said didn't exist but his experience confirmed was all that ever truly existed. When he closed his eyes for his afternoon nap, the world beyond the window continued. Clouds kept drifting. Birds kept flying. Trees kept growing imperceptibly, cell by cell, ring by ring, year by year. The universe went on performing its ancient operations, indifferent to whether any consciousness observed it or not. And this, too, was lesson, that we matter and don't matter simultaneously, that consciousness is both precious and insignificant, that the show goes on whether or not we're paying attention. But when Einstein woke, the world would still be there. The window would still frame it. And for a moment, that precious moment between sleep and full waking, he would see it fresh again, as though for the first time, before memory and habit reconstructed their familiar walls and reminded him who he was and what he was supposed to be thinking about. In that moment, he was not a physicist, not a genius, not the man who had rewritten the rules of space and time. He was simply awareness, opening to light, receiving the world as pure sensation before thought could categorize it, name it, reduce it to equations and explanations. The window allowed this, created the conditions for it, held space for this daily renewal of vision, this periodic return to the beginner's mind that sees everything as miraculous because it hasn't yet learned to take anything for granted. Years later, after Einstein's death, the chair remained by the window. The window continued framing sky and trees and weather, and those who visited the study, standing in that space where genius had rested each afternoon, would find themselves drawn to look through that glass, to see what he had seen, to understand what he had understood. But of course they couldn't. Not really. Because what mattered wasn't the view itself, but the practice of positioning oneself to receive it. Not the clouds or birds or changing seasons, but the daily choice to face toward light, to maintain connection with the simple and immediate even while wrestling with the abstract and cosmic, to remember that explanation, however brilliant, can never replace the naked fact of existence, the irreducible mystery of light falling through glass onto closed eyelids that will, in 15 minutes, open again to find the world still there, still strange, still beautiful, still infinitely worth observing. The window framed eternity, not in the sense that what it showed was eternal clouds dissolve, birds die, seasons turn and turn, but in the sense that the act of watching, the simple presence of awareness meeting world, belonged to no particular time, followed no local rules, existed in a space beyond before and after. This was Einstein's secret sanctuary, not the chair, though the chair mattered, not the sleep, though sleep was necessary, but the window, the threshold. The place where mind met cosmos, met light, met glass, met afternoon, met forever. And when his eyes opened, always the light would have shifted, time would have passed, the world would have continued its motion. And he would return, refreshed, to the equations that waited patiently on his desk, carrying with him the knowledge that some things like light falling, like clouds drifting, like the simple act of seeing remain forever beyond calculation, forever mysterious, forever worth the daily ritual of positioning oneself to witness them. The window knew this. The window held this. And every afternoon, without fail, it offered the same gift. Proof that the universe, for all its strangeness, for all its mathematical elegance, for all its hidden rules and surprising revelations, was also simply here immediate, sensory, present, available to anyone willing to open their eyes and look. There is a burden that has no physical mass, a weight that cannot be measured on any scale, yet presses down with force enough to bend the spine, to bow the shoulders, to transform a face over years from youth to something ancient, carved by the accumulated gravity of understanding too much. Einstein carried this weight, daily, hourly, in every waking moment of his adult life, not the weight of books, though his study overflowed with them. Not the weight of responsibility, though the world placed enormous expectations on his shoulders, but something heavier still, the weight of knowing, of seeing, of holding truths so vast, so strange, so utterly at odds with common sense that carrying them felt less like possession and more like being possessed, inhabited by ideas that demanded expression, required attention, refused to be ignored no matter how tired the mind that contained them became. It is said that genius is a gift. But those who carry it know different. They know it is also curse, also burden, also the kind of knowing that, once glimpsed, cannot be unknown, the door that, once opened, cannot be closed again, the vision that, once seen, cannot be unseen no matter how much one might wish to return to the comfort of ignorance. What does it feel like to know that space curves? Not to believe it, not to theorize about it, but to know it with the kind of certainty that most people reserve for the floor being solid beneath their feet. To understand that the universe you live in is stranger than anyone imagined, that the ground rules everyone assumes are not rules at all but local approximations, special cases of deeper principles so counterintuitive they sound like madness when spoken aloud. Einstein knew, and the knowing exhausted him. This was not the tiredness of physical labor, the good, clean fatigue that comes from lifting stones or plowing fields, the kind of exhaustion that a night's sleep can cure. This was something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of his bones, in the firing patterns of neurons that had been stretched too far for too long, in the constant tension of holding impossibilities in mind simultaneously while trying to forge them into something communicable, something others might understand. Beneath the silence of his afternoon rest lived this truth, that brilliance extracts a price, that seeing clearly costs something, that every insight gained is also innocence lost, simplicity abandoned, the comfortable story shattered by reality's stranger truth. His headaches began in his 30s. Not occasionally, but regularly splitting pains that would arrive without warning and pin him to his bed for hours. Unable to think, unable to work, his famous mind temporarily useless, reduced to nothing but suffering. Doctors examined him, prescribed remedies that rarely helped. They could find no physical cause. The pain was real, but its source was invisible. Some believed the headaches were his mind's rebellion, the body's way of insisting on limits that the intellect refused to acknowledge. A forced shutdown when voluntary rest was not taken. Pain as messenger, as teacher, as the only language that could get through to a consciousness that would otherwise never stop its relentless work. His stomach troubled him too. Ulcers, gastritis, the constant discomfort of a digestive system that seemed unable to process not just food, but the stress of containing so much understanding. He would eat little during his most intense periods of work, his appetite disappearing beneath the urgency of whatever problem occupied him. Friends worried. His wife worried. But Einstein himself seemed hardly to notice, as though physical hunger was irrelevant when measured against intellectual hunger, as though the body's needs were minor inconveniences compared to the mind's inexhaustible demands. And the loneliness, perhaps most of all, the loneliness. To see what others cannot see is to stand perpetually apart. To understand connections invisible to everyone else is to occupy a position of profound isolation. Einstein had colleagues, friends, people who admired and respected his work, but who could truly comprehend what it was like inside his consciousness, who could follow all the way down the paths his thinking traveled, who could keep pace with a mind that moved so quickly through abstract spaces that even its owner sometimes struggled to translate the journey into words. He wrote once, in a letter preserved in an archive somewhere, barely noticed among thousands of other documents. There are moments when I wonder if understanding is worth the isolation it brings, if seeing clearly is really preferable to seeing as others see together, as part of the herd. The truth is cold comfort when you must hold it alone. What cost comes with revelation? What price do we pay for seeing too clearly? The world celebrates genius, builds statues to it, writes biographies praising it. But the world does not have to live inside the mind that carries it. Does not have to experience the constant pressure of thoughts that won't stop, insights that arrive at 3 in the morning demanding to be written down, connections that present themselves at dinner parties and make conversation impossible, because how do you make small talk when your mind is watching the universe's mathematical structure unfold behind every casual comment? Einstein's afternoon naps were not luxury. They were necessity. A brief laying down of burdens too heavy for any single mind to carry without periodic relief. 15 minutes when he could be released from knowing, when consciousness could dissolve, and with it the weight of understanding, when the self that held all those truths could temporarily cease, and something simpler, just breath, just heartbeat, just biological process could take its place. But did sleep truly offer escape, or did the knowing follow him even there? Some who knew him spoke of how he would mutter in his sleep sometimes. Not words exactly, but sound syllables that might have been German, or might have been mathematics, the vocal cords producing the ghost of equations even while the conscious mind had departed. As though the work continued in darkness, as though even unconsciousness could not fully release him from the hunt, the endless pursuit of understanding that had become not just his profession but his identity, his purpose, his inescapable fate. There are stories impossible to verify, but haunting in their persistence of Einstein waking from his afternoon nap not refreshed, but more exhausted, as though sleep had offered no respite, but only a different arena for the same struggles. Of him sitting up in his chair, eyes opening, and immediately reaching for his pen as though to capture some vision that had pursued him even into rest, some equation that had presented itself in dreams and could not be allowed to escape. Was there no sanctuary? No place, even in sleep, where the mind could truly stop, marked by these traces, these glimpses of a consciousness that could not fully rest even when the body rested. Einstein's practice of afternoon sleep begins to look less like solution and more like temporary ceasefire in a war that could never be won. The mind against itself, understanding against exhaustion, the insatiable drive to know against the finite capacity to hold knowledge without breaking. And yet he continued, day after day, year after year, closing his eyes each afternoon despite knowing, or perhaps because of knowing, that the sleep would offer only partial relief, that the weight would still be there when he woke, that the burden of understanding would return the moment consciousness returned, heavy as ever, demanding as always. Why? Why continue? Why not simply stop? But that question reveals its own answer in the asking, because he could not stop, could not unknow what he knew, could not unsee what he had seen, could not close doors that had been opened, could not unthink thoughts that had been thought. The knowing, once acquired, was permanent. The understanding, once achieved, was irrevocable. There was no return to innocence, no path back to the comfortable ignorance that allows most people to move through the world without constantly confronting its strangeness. He had eaten from the tree of knowledge, and like the ancient story suggests, there was no going back to Eden. The garden was closed. The gate was locked. Forward was the only direction available, even when forward meant carrying more weight, bearing more burden, seeing more clearly into the abyss that looks back at us from the heart of existence. Some believe there was grace in this, that the very difficulty of Einstein's position was what made his afternoon naps so essential, so sacred. That the 15 minutes of surrender each day were not escape from his fate, but acceptance of it, acknowledgement that yes, this is hard, yes, this is exhausting, yes, this is a burden almost too heavy to carry. And therefore, rest is not weakness but wisdom. Pausing is not failure but strategy. Closing one's eyes is not giving up but gathering strength to continue. The weight of knowing did not lift when Einstein slept, but perhaps it distributed differently. Shifted from conscious to unconscious mind. Moved from the tight grip of waking thought to the more diffuse awareness of sleep, where burdens can be shared with deeper parts of ourselves, where the isolated consciousness can briefly merge with something larger, less lonely, less burdened by individual responsibility. Perhaps that was enough. Not solution, but respite. Not cure, but treatment. Not the removal of weight, but a brief period when the weight could be set down, transferred to someone else, even if that someone else was only his own sleeping self, even if the relief lasted only 15 minutes before he had to pick it up again. Where does genius come from? This question has haunted philosophers for millennia. Is it gift from gods? Accident of genetics? Result of environment, education, effort? No one knows. But wherever it comes with cost. The price of admission to the realm of profound understanding is the loss of simple peace. The cost of seeing clearly is the end of seeing comfortably. Einstein paid this price, paid it daily, and his afternoon naps were the mechanism by which he survived the payment, not avoiding the cost, but managing it, breaking it into installments small enough to bear, creating rhythms that allowed him to carry the unbearable by agreeing to set it down, briefly, regularly, before picking it up again. Did he ever wish he could unknow? Ever long for the days before relativity, before understanding, before his mind had opened to visions that would never leave him alone? We have hints that letter mentioning the cold comfort of truth, other comments scattered through correspondence about the loneliness of his position, the isolation of his understanding. But we also have his persistence, his refusal to stop despite the cost. His daily return to the equations, to the problems, to the relentless hunt for deeper understanding even when understanding itself was the burden he could barely carry. Perhaps this is the final mystery of genius, not that it exists, but that those who possess it continue despite knowing the price. That they choose, again and again, to carry weights that would crush most people. That they return daily to burdens that offer no peace, no comfort, no relief except the brief respites of sleep and the occasional satisfaction of insight which itself simply adds more weight, more understanding, more knowing to the already overwhelming load. Einstein closed his eyes each afternoon. The weight remained, but for 15 minutes he didn't have to actively carry it, could let it rest where it would. Could surrender to darkness that asked nothing, understood nothing, required nothing but his willingness to stop trying. And perhaps, in the end, that was grace enough. Not the removal of burden, but permission to set it down. Not escape from knowledge, but temporary release from the exhausting work of holding it. Not freedom from the weight of seeing clearly, but 15 minutes when clear sight was not required, when the eyes could close, and the universe could carry on without his understanding, at least for a little while. The weight would still be there when he woke. It always was. But rested, renewed, restored by brief darkness, he could lift it again. Carry it forward, bear what needed bearing, until tomorrow, when the ritual would repeat, the burden would be set down. And for 15 minutes, in a chair by a window where afternoon light fell like blessing, genius could rest from being genius and simply be human, tired, heavy, exhausted by knowing, but still, somehow, willing to continue. There are hours that the world devours, that disappear into the mouths of obligation, expectation, the endless appetite of others who need something, want something, believe they deserve a piece of you because of what you know, what you've accomplished, what you represent to them. And then there are hours that resist, that draw boundaries, that say quietly but with absolute finality, not this, not now, this time is mine. Between 2 and 3 o'clock each afternoon, Einstein claimed such an hour. Carved it from the day like sanctuary carved from wilderness, like temple raised in territory that wanted to consume it. This was not the hour of physics, not the hour of correspondence or lectures or meetings with earnest students who believed their questions deserved immediate answers. This was not the hour of being Albert Einstein, genius, celebrity, the mind that belonged to the world. This was the hour that belonged to no one, not even to him in a sense, because in sleep, ownership dissolves. The self releases its grip, and what remains is simply life continuing, breath moving, blood flowing, without anyone claiming possession of the process. But the claiming of that hour, the deliberate protection of it, the fierce guarding of its boundaries, that was very much his doing. That was Einstein understanding what most never learn, that to give anything of value to the world, one must first preserve something for oneself. That the well runs dry if we draw from it constantly without allowing it to refill. That generosity becomes martyrdom, becomes nothing at all if we cannot say, at least sometimes, at least for small but sacred stretches of time, no. It is said that fame is a blessing. That recognition, acclaim, the world's attention, these are rewards to be sought, treasures to be grateful for. And perhaps for some they are. But those who live inside fame's harsh light know its true nature, know that it devours privacy, that it transforms you from person into symbol, from human being into public property, from someone with boundaries into someone the world believes it owns. Einstein learned this gradually, then suddenly. The publication of his theory of relativity in 1915 made him known in scientific circles. But it was the eclipse expedition of 1919, when British astronomers confirmed that starlight bent around the sun exactly as his equations predicted, that made him famous in the broader sense. Newspapers proclaimed him. Magazines sought interviews. The public, hungry for heroes after the devastation of the Great War, seized upon this gentle man with wild hair and revolutionary ideas about the universe. Overnight, it seemed, he belonged to everyone. Letters arrived daily by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Requests for his time, his opinion, his blessing on various causes and projects and theories. Students appeared at his door unannounced. Strangers approached him on the street, wanting to shake his hand, to touch the man who had touched the infinite. Photographers followed him. Journalists ambushed him. The world decided it had the right to him, to his attention, to pieces of his consciousness whenever it pleased. And for a while, he tried. Tried to accommodate. Tried to be the public Einstein everyone wanted, accessible, generous with his time, patient with questions that revealed fundamental misunderstandings of his work, but were asked with such earnest hope that refusing to answer seemed cruel. He tried to be what the world demanded, and it nearly destroyed him. Beneath the silence of his study, in moments when the door was closed and the world temporarily held at bay, he would feel it. The depletion, the exhaustion that came not from thinking but from being perpetually available, perpetually on display, perpetually required to be more than human, more than one person could possibly be. The headaches worsened. The stomach problems intensified. He would find himself unable to work, unable to think, his famous mind reduced to fog and static by the sheer overwhelming pressure of being needed by too many people in too many ways all at once. Something had to change. Some line had to be drawn. Some space had to be protected, or there would be nothing left of him to protect, nothing left to give, nothing left that was genuinely his. The afternoon nap became that line. Helen Dukas understood this before Einstein fully articulated it himself. She had been hired as his secretary, but quickly became something more. Guardian, gatekeeper, the fierce protector of boundaries he was too gentle to enforce himself. She learned to read the signs of his depletion. She learned to recognize when the demands were too much, when the well was running dry, when the man who seemed inexhaustible was, in fact, exhausted. And she learned to say no on his behalf. Professor Einstein is not available between 2 and 3 o'clock. She said it hundreds of times, thousands perhaps over the years, to colleagues who insisted their need was urgent, to journalists who promised just 5 minutes, to students who had traveled far and surely deserved an exception, to officials bearing important matters that could not wait, to friends who thought because they were friends that the rules didn't apply to them. No exceptions, no emergencies, no compromises. At first, some were offended. How dare she? How dare he? Didn't he understand how important this was? Didn't he know that people needed him, that the world had questions, that his obligation to share his genius outweighed his need for rest? But Helen Dukas stood firm, and gradually, grudgingly, the world learned. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, Einstein was unreachable, not because he was being difficult, not because he was selfish, but because he had learned what survival required. That 1 hour must be sacred, must be protected, must be allowed to exist outside the endless cycle of demand and response, need and fulfillment, the world asking and him answering until there was nothing left to answer with. Some believe this was revolutionary. That Einstein's insistence on this protected hour represented a kind of resistance against the machinery of modern life that wants to consume us completely, that demands constant productivity, constant availability, constant sacrifice of self to the demands of others. And perhaps it was. Perhaps by claiming that hour, by guarding it so fiercely, by refusing to allow the world to colonize every minute of his existence, Einstein was practicing a kind of spiritual resistance. Saying through his daily ritual what words could not fully express, that a person, even a genius, even someone with gifts the world desperately needs, is still a person, still finite, still requiring care, still deserving of time that belongs to no one, not even perhaps especially not to themselves as public figure, as symbol, as the Einstein everyone thought they owned. Where does obligation end? When can we claim that we have given enough? These are questions without clear answers, especially for those who possess rare gifts, whose contributions matter in ways that ordinary work does not. How much does genius owe the world? How much must brilliance sacrifice for the collective good? Einstein's answer, delivered not through argument but through daily practice, was this: genius owes the world everything it can sustainably give. But sustainability requires rest, requires boundaries, requires the courage to say that some hours are off limits, some space is protected, some part of the self must remain untouched by others' needs, or there will be nothing left to give anyone. His colleagues learned this gradually. The wise ones, at least. They learned to schedule their meetings around the sacred hour, to approach him before 2 or wait until after 3, to respect the rhythm that sustained him, even when they could not fully understand it. And some of them, watching Einstein's practice, began to adopt similar boundaries themselves, carving out their own protected hours, learning to say no to some demands so they could say yes to what mattered most, discovering that productivity is not constant output but rhythmic alternation, that giving requires first having, that to serve others one must occasionally refuse others. This is wisdom that every age must relearn. That every generation resists at first, thinking that noble sacrifice means giving until there is nothing left to give. But Einstein knew better. He had tried the path of unlimited availability and found it led only to depletion, exhaustion, the slow death of the very gifts the world needed from him. So he drew the line, protected the hour, and in protecting it preserved himself. Not selfishly, though some called it selfish. Not cruelly, though some felt refused, rejected, shut out. But necessarily, fundamentally, with the same rigor he brought to his physics, recognizing that certain laws cannot be violated without consequence, that certain needs cannot be ignored without cost. Marked by the clock's hands moving toward 2, the household would grow quiet. Visitors would be shown out. Phone calls would go unanswered. The door to his study would close. And for 1 hour, 60 minutes, the world would have to carry on without him. And carry on it did. The universe did not collapse because Einstein was sleeping. Physics continued operating according to its laws whether or not he was conscious to observe them. The problems that seemed so urgent at 1:45 could wait until 3:00. Life went on. This is perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of his practice, the demonstration that the world does not need us as desperately as we fear it does. That stepping back, even briefly, even from important work, does not cause catastrophe but creates space. Space for rest. Space for others to step forward. space for problems to solve themselves or reveal themselves as less urgent than they seemed. The radical act of rest, the courage to be temporarily unavailable, the wisdom to know that protecting one's own capacity is not selfishness but the precondition for genuine service. Einstein understood this, practiced this, and in practicing it, gave permission, though he never said as much explicitly, for others to do the same, to claim their own hours, to draw their own boundaries, to recognize that belonging to the world does not mean being owned by it, that sharing one's gifts does not require sacrificing one's humanity. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, he belonged to no one, not to Princeton, not to physics, not to the students who revered him or the public who celebrated him or the world that needed him. He belonged only to the silence, to the darkness, to the mercy of sleep that asks nothing and gives everything. And when he woke, refreshed, renewed, restored by that protected hour, he could return to belonging to everyone again, could pick up the pen, could answer the letters, could meet with the students and colleagues and visitors who needed his time, could be generous, patient, available, but only because the hour had protected him, only because the boundary had held. Only because he had learned the paradox that those who give most must sometimes refuse to give at all, that the most generous act is knowing when to say no, that love for the world requires first loving oneself enough to preserve the self that loves. This is the hour that belonged to no one, and in belonging to no one, it allowed Einstein to belong truly and sustainably to everyone. The wisdom remains. The practice endures. And the question it poses to each of us persists. Do we have the courage to claim our own hour, to protect our own boundaries, to say, at least sometimes, at least for sacred stretches of time, not this, not now, this belongs to no one, this is mine. There are silences that speak, absences that reveal more than presence ever could. Gaps in the record that tell stories the written word cannot contain. Einstein kept no dream journal. This fact, so easily overlooked, becomes more significant the longer we contemplate it. Here was a man who documented obsessively, who filled notebook after notebook with equations, calculations, tentative explorations of mathematical territory no one had mapped before, who wrote thousands of letters across his lifetime, explaining his work, defending his theories, corresponding with colleagues and strangers alike, who seemed, in almost every aspect of his intellectual life, determined to make his thinking visible, transparent, available for examination. And yet, when it came to his afternoon naps, when it came to what happened in those 15 minutes of daily darkness, the record grows mysteriously sparse. Not absent entirely, we have those fragments we've already encountered, those glimpses and hints scattered across decades, but sparse, deliberately so, as though Einstein had drawn a line, had decided that some experiences were too private, too precious, too fundamentally untranslatable to submit to documentation. What remains is suggestion, shadow, the outline of something that resists being fully seen. It is said that the deepest truths cannot be spoken. That language, for all its power, for all its flexibility, fails at certain thresholds. That there exist experiences so subtle, so interior, so dependent on direct knowing that any attempt to describe them to someone who hasn't had them results only in distortion, in reduction, in the killing of the very thing you're trying to share. Perhaps Einstein understood this. Perhaps his silence about his nap experiences was not withholding, but wisdom, the recognition that some territories of consciousness can only be visited, never mapped. That what happened in those 15 minutes belonged to a realm where words cannot follow, where even his considerable gifts for explanation reached their limit. Beneath the silence of the record, beneath the gaps and absences, we can discern traces, hints of something he experienced but chose not to fully describe. A line in a letter to Max Born, his friend and fellow physicist, written in 1936, had the most peculiar vision upon waking from my afternoon rest today. Geometric forms that seemed to breathe, to pulse with interior light. I will not attempt to explain it further, you would think me mad, or I would fail to capture it, or both. The restraint in those words is striking. The man who spent his life trying to make the invisible visible, who dedicated himself to translating mathematical abstractions into concepts others could grasp, here explicitly refusing to elaborate. I will not attempt to explain it further. Not, I cannot, though perhaps that was implied, but I will not. A choice, a boundary, a recognition that some experiences lose their truth when dragged into the light of explanation. Another fragment, this one from a notebook discovered after his death. In the margin beside an equation he'd been wrestling with for weeks, a simple note. Solution came in afternoon sleep, woke knowing, cannot trace the path backward. Cannot trace the path backward. This phrase haunts. It suggests that the solution arrived fully formed, complete, but without any memory of the process by which it was reached. As though his sleeping mind had solved the problem, but refused to show its work, offering only the answer and leaving the conscious mind to wonder how it got there. Did this happen often? These mysterious arrivals of insight from territories his waking consciousness could not access. The gaps in the record make it impossible to say. But the few mentions we have suggest it was not unique, not isolated, but perhaps a regular feature of his practice, the sleeping mind solving what the waking mind could not, then vanishing back into darkness without leaving traces of its methods. Some believe Einstein guarded these experiences because they threatened his image as rational scientist. That dreams and visions and mysterious knowings did not fit the narrative of genius as logical, methodical, arriving at truth through calculation and rigor. That the public Einstein explainer of the universe, symbol of human reason's triumph, could not afford to admit that some of his greatest insights came from sources he himself did not understand. But this interpretation feels shallow, almost insulting. Those who knew Einstein speak of his profound humility in the face of mystery, his willingness to admit ignorance, his comfort with not knowing. He spent his later years searching for a unified field theory he never completed, never achieving the final synthesis he sought. He died with problems unsolved, questions unanswered. This was not a man afraid to acknowledge the limits of understanding. No. His silence about the nap experiences seems to have come from somewhere else, from recognition that certain truths are too fragile for speech, that certain experiences exist in territories where language has no jurisdiction, that bringing them into discourse would not illuminate them, but would instead obscure them, would trade direct knowing for second-hand description, would sacrifice the reality for its shadow. Where does insight come from? This question haunted Einstein professionally, and won suspects personally as well. His theories of relativity did not arrive through linear deduction, step by step from established premises to inevitable conclusions. They came through intuition, through what he called thought experiments, imaginary scenarios that allowed him to grasp relationships that formal mathematics could only describe later, only translate into equations after the fundamental insight had already occurred. But where did those thought experiments come from? What allowed him to imagine riding a beam of light, or falling in an elevator, or watching clocks from a moving train scenarios that seemed absurd but contained profound truths about the nature of space and time? He could not fully answer. And perhaps the nap experiences were similar sources of insight whose origins remained obscure, whose mechanisms remained hidden, whose fruits could be harvested, but whose roots could not be traced. The temptation, when faced with such mysteries, is to fill the gaps with speculation, to create theories about what Einstein must have experienced, what he must have dreamed, what visions must have moved through his sleeping consciousness. But to do so would be to violate the very silence he chose to maintain, to claim knowledge where he offered only suggestion, to make concrete what he deliberately left fluid. Better, perhaps, to honor the gaps. To acknowledge that we do not know cannot know what happened in the full depth of those afternoon descents into darkness. To accept that Einstein's most private experiences remain private, even now, even after death, protected by the simple fact that he chose not to record them. Marked by absence, by what was not said rather than what was, Einstein's practice of afternoon sleep becomes even more mysterious. The documented fragments only highlight how much remains undocumented. The few mentions only emphasize how many moments went unmentioned. For every peculiar vision he hinted at in a letter, how many others went unremarked? For every solution that arrived mysteriously upon waking, how many others came from the same source but were attributed to ordinary thought, or not attributed at all, their origin already forgotten by the time they were written down? The record cannot tell us. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. There is a sovereignty in silence, a power in refusal. Einstein, who spent his life sharing, explaining, making visible the universe's hidden structures, also knew when to withhold, when to keep certain territories unexplored, at least in public discourse, when to maintain mysteries rather than attempting to solve them. And perhaps this is the final lesson of his nap practice, not just the importance of rest, not just the necessity of boundaries, not just the wisdom of surrender, but also this, that some experiences are too intimate to share. That consciousness has depths that resist documentation, that the most profound knowing sometimes requires accepting that we will never fully know how we came to know it. His sleeping mind solved problems his waking mind could not. This much seems certain from the fragments we have, but the process remained, even to him, fundamentally mysterious. The path from darkness to insight could not be retraced. The mechanism by which 15 minutes of sleep could unlock what weeks of waking effort could not remain forever unclear. And Einstein, who could have invented explanations, who could have theorized, speculated, constructed elaborate frameworks to account for these mysterious arrivals of understanding, chose, instead, to simply accept. To use what sleep gave him without demanding to understand the giving. To receive gifts from the darkness without requiring the darkness to explain itself. This is humility of the highest order. This is wisdom that even genius must bow to. This is the recognition that we are not transparent to ourselves, that consciousness contains territories we cannot map, that the self who solves problems in sleep may be wiser than the self who tries to solve them while awake, and that this is perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable, no explanation required. So we are left with fragments, with hints, with the knowledge that something significant happened in those afternoon naps, something that went beyond mere physical restoration, something that touched on the nature of creativity itself, the mystery of how understanding emerges from the unmarked darkness of unconsciousness. But we are left also with silence, with gaps that will not be filled, with the sovereignty of experiences that remain, even now, private. Protected not by locks or secrets, but by the simple fact that they were never fully translated into words, never fully dragged into the light where others could examine them. Perhaps Einstein looked at what he experienced in those 15 minutes and recognized that language would fail it. That describing a geometric form that breathes, numbers that sing, the feeling of waking with tears and wonder would only create confusion, would substitute pale description for vivid experience, would offer shadow instead of substance. Perhaps he knew that his colleagues would try to explain it away: brain chemistry, neural processes, the predictable operations of arresting consciousness, and that these explanations, while possibly accurate at some level, would miss the essential quality of the experience itself, would reduce mystery to mechanism, would trade off for understanding of a kind that understands nothing important. So he kept it private, let it remain in darkness, allowed those territories of his inner life to exist unobserved, undocumented, unshared, not from fear or shame, but from respect. From recognition that some things are too precious to expose, too subtle to survive translation, too true to risk distortion. The memory of darkness, what he remembered from those 15 minutes, what traces remained when consciousness returned this, stayed largely his alone. We have glimpses, hints, suggestions, but the full depth of those experiences, the complete texture of what it was like to be Einstein drifting between waking and sleep, solving problems through processes he could not name, receiving insights from sources he could not identify, this remains forever beyond our reach. And that, finally, is gift, not frustration. Not gap to be filled, but mystery to be honored. Einstein's silence about his deepest nap experiences teaches us that not everything needs explaining, that some territories should remain unexplored, that consciousness has sovereignty, and that sovereignty includes the right to keep certain experiences private, certain knowings unshared, certain truths protected by the simple, powerful act of choosing not to speak them. The darkness remembers what he chose not to say. And in that silence, in that protected space, something essential remains alive, more alive, perhaps, than it could ever be if translated into words, filed into categories, explained away into comprehensibility. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. Some silences speak more truthfully than any words. And Einstein, in his wisdom, knew when to explain and when to simply close his eyes, descend into darkness, and let what happened there remain forever between himself and the night. Afternoon light has its own quality, its own voice, its own particular way of announcing that the day has passed its zenith and begun, however slowly, its long descent toward evening. Not the harsh brightness of noon, when shadows shrink to nothing and the sun stands directly overhead, interrogating. Not the golden drama of sunset, when the world catches fire and the sky performs its daily theater of ending. But something between, something softer. Light that has traveled through more atmosphere, that has been filtered and gentled, that arrives at windows slanted, warm, touched with amber, carrying in its beams the promise of transition from day to evening, from waking to rest, from effort to release. This was the light Einstein woke to, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. His eyes would open slowly. Not the abrupt jolt of alarm or emergency, but gradual emergence consciousness returning the way dawn comes, so slowly at first that you cannot name the moment when darkness ends and light begins. His vision would be blurred initially, the world soft and unformed, shapes visible but not yet sharp, presence sensed but not yet defined. And there it would be, the light, falling through the window at that particular angle that meant exactly 2:15. That told him, without need for clock or calculation, that his brief journey had reached its natural conclusion, that the 15 minutes had passed, that the darkness had held him and was now gently, returning him to the world of open eyes and awareness. It is said that some people wake disoriented, needing moments to remember where they are, who they are, what day it is. But Einstein woke to constancy. The same chair beneath him, the same window before him, the same slant of light that had been there yesterday and would be there tomorrow, reliable as mathematics, predictable as planetary motion. Did the light wake him? Or did his body's internal rhythm simply know? This question has no certain answer. Sleep researchers speak of circadian cycles, of ultradian rhythms, of the body's sophisticated timekeeping mechanisms that operate without conscious oversight. They speak of how sleep unfolds in predictable stages, how 15 minutes is just long enough to complete certain cycles, how the body can learn to wake itself at appointed times through pure repetition, through habit carved so deep it becomes autonomic. But there is also the light itself, real, physical. Photons striking closed eyelids, penetrating the thin membrane of skin, reaching the retina even through the veil of sleep, triggering responses that consciousness may not register but the body certainly does. Light as signal, light as summons, light as gentle hand on shoulder saying, "It's time, return now, come back." Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the internal clock and the external light had learned over years of practice to collaborate, to speak the same language, to agree on the moment of transition, working together to end sleep neither too soon nor too late, but exactly when restoration had reached its fullness. Beneath the silence of those waking moments lived a profound intimacy. Einstein and the light had met this way thousands of times, had performed this ritual of departure and return until it became more than habit, more than routine became relationship. The light waited for him each afternoon in the darkness of sleep. And when the time came, it was there to receive him, to welcome him back, to show him that the world had continued in his absence, that the universe still operated according to its laws, that nothing essential had been lost during his brief departure. Some days the light would be clear, sharp-edged, creating defined beams through which dust particles drifted like stars in some miniature cosmos. Einstein would watch them for a moment or perhaps longer, perhaps several moments, because in the threshold between sleep and full waking, time moves differently, becomes elastic, unreliable, measured not by clock but by breath, by the gradual focusing of vision, by the slow reassembly of the self that had temporarily dispersed. The dust motes were never random, though they appeared so. Each particle followed precise trajectories, obeying laws of aerodynamics, responding to air currents too subtle for conscious perception, dancing according to rules that could be calculated but were more beautiful when simply observed. Einstein knew he could describe their motion mathematically, could predict their paths, could reduce their apparent freedom to equations. But watching them drift through afternoon light, still half asleep, he could also see them as pure phenomenon, as mystery, as evidence that the universe delights in beauty for its own sake, not because anyone calculates it. Other days the light would be diffused, filtered through clouds that made the sky into one vast softness, and the beams would be less defined, the boundaries between lit and shadowed less certain. On these days, waking felt even more gradual, as though the gentleness of the light encouraged gentleness in the return to consciousness. No harsh edges, no sharp transitions, just the slow brightening of awareness, the soft reassembly of thought and memory, and the knowledge of who and where and when. Where does the self go during sleep? And where does it return from? These questions, which we have touched on before, become even more acute in the moment of waking. Because here, in this threshold state, one can almost sense the process happening, can almost feel the self being reconstructed, piece by piece, memory by memory. The body returns first sensation of weight in the chair, pressure of head against cushion, the feeling of hands resting on armrests. Then comes location, the study, Princeton, afternoon. Then identity, I am Einstein. Then purpose, I was resting, and now I must return to work. But for a moment, before all that reassembly completes itself, there is something else. Something that has no name, no identity, no particular location. Just awareness, just presence, just the simple fact of being conscious, of experiencing without yet having organized that experience into the familiar categories of self and world, here and there, now and then. The light held him in that moment, did not rush him, made no demands. Simply was, as it had been while he slept, as it would continue to be whether or not any consciousness observed it. The light was patient, had been falling at this angle for millions of years before Einstein was born, would continue falling at this angle for millions more after he was gone. The cosmic indifference of photons traveling from sun to earth, obeying laws of propagation, caring nothing for the particular consciousness that happened to wake within their reach. And yet, to Einstein in those moments, the light felt almost personal, almost like greeting, almost like the universe saying, "Welcome back. I am still here, still operating according to the principles you have discovered, still beautiful, still mysterious despite all understanding, still worth your attention, your wonder, your love." Marked by this daily return, by this repeated emergence into afternoon light, Einstein's life took on a quality of ritual that transcended mere habit. Each waking was not just return to consciousness, but renewal of relationship with the world, with the study, with the work waiting on his desk, with the questions that had no answers yet, but might, perhaps, yield their secrets if he approached them with the clarity that comes only after rest. Some days he would lie there longer than necessary. The 15 minutes had passed. His body had woken. But he would remain still in the chair, eyes open but not yet engaged, watching the light, watching the dust, watching the world breathe around him. Not thinking exactly. Not yet returned to the mode of calculation and analysis, just witnessing, just being present to the simple fact of existence, to the impossible beauty of light falling through space, to the mystery that anything exists at all. These were perhaps his most philosophical moments, though he would have resisted calling them that. Philosophy was abstraction, argumentation, the building of logical structures. This was something else. This was direct encounter with being, unmediated by theory or explanation. This was knowing that came not through reason but through presence, through the willingness to simply look and see without immediately trying to understand. The universe had waited. This was what the light told him each afternoon. While he slept, while he was absent, while consciousness had dissolved into darkness, the universe had carried on. Faithfully, reliably, following its laws with perfect consistency, not needing him to observe it, to understand it, to explain it to anyone. Simply being, simply continuing, simply unfolding according to principles that were old when the first star ignited and would remain true when the last star dimmed. And yet he was needed too, or at least, he chose to act as though he were. Because observing the universe, understanding it, explaining it, these were not necessities for the universe, but they were necessities for him, for humanity, for the particular way that consciousness tries to comprehend the reality that gave birth to it. The universe would continue whether or not anyone understood it, but understanding mattered anyway, not to the universe, but to those doing the understanding. The light knew this somehow, or seemed to wait patiently for him to finish his rest and return to his equations, while also suggesting that the equations could wait too, that there was no rush, that existence was patient, that truth reveals itself according to its own timeline, not ours. Einstein would watch the light, and the light would illuminate, and for a moment sometimes brief, sometimes extended, always impossible to measure by ordinary time, they would exist together in perfect simplicity, light being light, consciousness being consciousness, neither needing to be anything other than what they were. Then, when the moment had fully ripened, when the threshold had been crossed and waking was complete, he would move, would shift in his chair, would reach for his spectacles, would prepare to return to the world of thought, of work, of the endless hunt for understanding. But he would carry something with him from that moment of waking, some quality absorbed from the patient light, some reminder that the universe, for all its complexity, for all its strangeness, for all its resistance to being fully known, was also this: light falling through a window, dust drifting through beams, the simple, immediate fact of existence revealing itself to consciousness that had been away and had now returned. The light that waited, that was always there. That asked nothing, but offered everything: illumination, beauty, constancy, the proof that when we close our eyes and drift into darkness, the world does not disappear but continues, faithful, patient, ready to receive us when we wake. This was Einstein's afternoon gift. Not insight or solution or breakthrough, though those sometimes came, but something more fundamental: the experience of returning, of being absent and then present again, of dying in small ways and being resurrected, of darkness giving way to light again and again, day after day, teaching the oldest lesson: that endings are temporary, that rest restores, that the light always waits. There are mysteries we solve, and mysteries we inhabit, problems we answer, and questions we simply learn to live inside, turning them over like smooth stones in the pocket, carrying them everywhere, never quite setting them down because they have become part of us, inseparable from the hand that holds them. For all his insights into the universe's mechanics, Einstein never developed a theory of napping. This fact is extraordinary when you consider it. Here was a man who could tell you why time dilates near massive objects, how gravity bends the path of light, what happens to energy and mass when they convert from one form to the other. He could explain the photoelectric effect, the nature of Brownian motion, the statistical distribution of molecules in gas. He could take the most counterintuitive phenomena, the constancy of light speed, the relativity of simultaneity, the curvature of spacetime, and render them comprehensible, wrapping complex mathematics in language that non-specialists could at least begin to grasp. But ask him why 15 minutes of afternoon sleep restored his mind when 14 minutes left him groggy, and he could only shrug. Ask him why his body demanded rest at exactly 2 o'clock regardless of how well he'd slept the night before, and he had no answer. Ask him to explain the mechanism by which brief sleep opened gates to insight that hours of waking effort could not unlock, and he was as mystified as anyone. Some mysteries, it seemed, resisted even his analysis. It is said that this bothered him at first, that in his younger years, when he still believed that sufficient understanding could penetrate any question, he tried to theorize about his own sleep patterns, kept notes, briefly, about when he napped and how he felt afterward, tried to correlate his afternoon rest with his productivity, his clarity, his ability to solve problems, approached his own embodied experience the way he approached physical phenomena as something that could be measured, quantified, understood. But the practice defied this approach. The harder he tried to understand it, the more elusive it became. The moment he began analyzing his naps, they changed quality, became self-conscious, lost some essential characteristic that made them restorative. It was as though the practice only worked when he surrendered to it, when he stopped trying to explain it and simply did it. So he learned to let it remain mysterious, learned that some aspects of existence cannot be theorized, only practiced. That the body carries wisdom the mind cannot formulate. That consciousness rests on foundations it can observe but never fully comprehend. Beneath the silence of this acceptance lived profound humility. Einstein spent his professional life expanding the boundaries of human understanding, pushing into territories that had seemed forever beyond reach, proving that the universe could be known more deeply than anyone had imagined. His whole career was an argument for the power of human intellect, for consciousness's ability to decode reality's deepest structures. And yet here, in the simple matter of his own need for afternoon rest, he encountered a limit. Not a limit of the universe's comprehensibility, but a limit of comprehension itself. A boundary where understanding could go no further because the thing being studied was also the thing doing the studying, because consciousness investigating itself reaches a strange recursive loop where subject and object collapse into each other. Why did his naps work? Why did 15 minutes provide restoration that no amount of coffee or willpower could match? Why did the timing matter, the ritual matter, the chair and window and afternoon light all matter in ways that seemed absurdly specific yet were undeniably real? He could not say, could only report that it did work, that these things did matter, that the whole complex architecture of his afternoon practice had assembled itself not through deliberate design, but through attention, through trial and error, through listening to what his body needed and honoring that need even when he couldn't explain it. This is wisdom of a different order than the wisdom of his physics. This is the wisdom that animals possess without needing to articulate it. The wisdom that tells birds when to migrate, that tells trees when to drop their leaves, that tells all living things how to navigate the world not through understanding, but through deep instinct, through attunement to rhythms older than thought. Einstein's body knew what his mind could not prove, knew that 2 o'clock was the time for rest, knew that 15 minutes was the optimal duration, knew that the chair must face the window, that the light mattered, that the ritual of setting down pen and closing notebook created necessary boundaries between waking work and sleeping restoration. How did his body know these things? Through what mechanism did embodied wisdom operate? The questions have no answers. Or rather, they have scientific answers: circadian rhythms, homeostatic sleep pressure, neural restoration processes, but these answers somehow miss the essential mystery. They describe what happens without capturing why it matters, how it feels, what it means to be the consciousness inhabiting the body that knows these things without being told. Where does wisdom live? In the mind, we assume. In the prefrontal cortex, in the seat of reason and deliberation and conscious choice. But Einstein's practice suggests otherwise. Suggests that wisdom lives also perhaps primarily in the body, in the autonomic nervous system that regulates breath and heartbeat without conscious oversight, in the ancient brain structures that track time and light and need, in the flesh itself, which remembers patterns, responds to rhythms, knows things that consciousness can only dimly perceive. This is perhaps the final paradox of Einstein's life, that the man who proved the universe could be understood through mathematics never fully understood the practice that allowed him to do that mathematics. That genius required maintenance it could not explain. That brilliance depended on rhythms it could not theorize. That the mind that mapped spacetime remained forever mysterious to itself. Some believe this was mercy. That if Einstein had been able to fully explain his nap practice, had been able to reduce it to mechanism and formula, something essential would have been lost. The practice worked, in part, because it remained beyond complete analysis, because it required surrender rather than control, because it operated in territory where understanding had to give way to trust, where consciousness had to admit its limits and bow to the body's deeper intelligence. And perhaps that was the ultimate lesson, the one that took a lifetime to fully learn, that some truths cannot be proven, only lived, that certain forms of knowledge resist articulation, that the most profound understanding sometimes requires accepting that we will never fully understand. Marked by this acceptance, by this willing embrace of mystery, Einstein's final years show a different quality than his early ones. The fierce drive to explain everything softened into something gentler. The insistence that all questions must have answers yielded to recognition that some questions serve us better by remaining questions. The need to know gave way, gradually, to comfort with not knowing, to peace with mystery, to trust in processes that operated beyond the reach of conscious comprehension. He still worked, of course, still sought understanding, still filled notebooks with equations and correspondence with explanations. The drive to know never left him entirely. It was too fundamental to who he was, too woven into his identity to be separated out. But alongside that drive lived something else now, a recognition that he was not only mind, but also body, not only consciousness, but also flesh. Not only the observer who seeks to understand, but also the organism that simply lives, that follows rhythms it did not choose, that knows things it cannot articulate. His afternoon naps became, in this light, more than mere rest. They became daily practice in humility, daily acknowledgement that for all his genius, for all his insights, for all his revolutionary understanding of physical reality, he remained fundamentally mysterious to himself. That the body he inhabited operated according to principles that preceded understanding and would outlast it. That wisdom came not only through calculation but through surrender, not only through effort but through the courage to cease effort and trust what happens when we stop trying. Each afternoon, the same ritual. Set down the pen, remove the glasses, close the notebook, move to the chair, allow the eyes to close. Drift into darkness that no equation illuminates, that no theory explains, that simply is, has always been, will always be the oldest mystery, the most fundamental question, the one we answer not by solving, but by entering again and again, until finally we understand that entering is the only answer there ever was. The practice worked. This much was undeniable. Einstein's productivity, his clarity, his ability to maintain creative intensity across decades, all of this depended on his afternoon rest. Remove the naps, and everything would have collapsed. His body had taught him this through experience, through the simple fact that when he honored the practice he flourished, and when he violated it he suffered. But how it worked, why it worked in the precise way it did, these questions remained forever beyond the reach of theory. Beyond the reach even of Einstein's formidable intellect. And in remaining beyond reach, they taught perhaps the most important lesson, that we are not gods. That consciousness, for all its power, exists within constraints it cannot fully map. That being human means being forever incomplete in our understanding, forever dependent on processes we cannot control, forever trusting in the body's wisdom even when the mind cannot grasp the logic of that wisdom. The universe could be understood. Einstein had proven this beyond doubt. Space and time could be mapped. Matter and energy could be shown to be convertible. The deepest patterns of physical reality could yield their secrets to patient investigation and brilliant insight, but the self remained mysterious. The practice of being alive, of inhabiting consciousness, of navigating each day through the alternation of waking and sleeping, this could not be reduced to theory, could not be solved, could only be practiced, day after day, honoring what worked even when explanation failed. And perhaps that was gift. Perhaps the fact that his nap practice resisted understanding was what made it sustainable, because it kept him humble, because it reminded him daily that he was not separate from the universe he studied but part of it, subject to its mysteries, benefiting from its wisdom, dependent on forces he could name but never fully grasp. So he rested, each afternoon, for 15 minutes, in a chair by a window, letting darkness claim him briefly before light returned him to the world, not understanding why it worked, just knowing that it did, just trusting the body's ancient intelligence, just surrendering again and again to the practice that no theory could explain, but that explained, in its own wordless way, something more fundamental than any theory ever could, that we are mystery to ourselves. That wisdom lives in the flesh. That consciousness floats on currents it cannot see. That the deepest knowing comes not from explanation, but from participation, not from solving, but from inhabiting, not from understanding, but from the daily courage to close one's eyes and trust the darkness to be kind. Einstein understood the universe. The universe understood Einstein better, knew his need for rest before he recognized it, knew the optimal duration of his naps before he calculated it, knew the rhythms that would sustain him through a lifetime of extraordinary work. And in the end, after all the equations and all the insights and all the revolutionary discoveries, this is perhaps his most profound teaching, that true wisdom means knowing when to stop seeking understanding. That brilliance includes recognizing the limits of brilliance. That the highest form of intelligence is learning to trust what we cannot explain, to honor what we cannot prove, to practice what works even when we don't know why. The light falls. The afternoon arrives. The body knows it's time to rest. And consciousness, that marvelous mystery that spent its waking hours trying to explain everything, surrenders to the one practice it can never fully explain, the simple, sacred, utterly mysterious act of closing one's eyes and letting go. This is the practice that no theory could explain, and in its resistance to explanation lived its deepest truth, that some things are too essential to be understood, too fundamental to be solved, too true to need any proof beyond the daily evidence of a life well lived, a mind sustained, a body honored in its ancient needs. Einstein rested, not because he understood rest, but because rest understood him. And in that reversal consciousness, surrendering to the body's deeper knowing, lived all the wisdom that no equation could capture, no theory could contain, no explanation could improve upon. The practice endures. The mystery remains. And somewhere in that space between what we know and what knows us, between understanding and being understood, between waking and sleep and waking again, lies the truth that Einstein practiced daily but never reduced to formula, that we are here, that we are alive, that we need rest. And that this need, like all our deepest needs, comes from somewhere older and wiser than thought, somewhere that has no language but teaches perfectly anyway, somewhere that asks only that we listen and trust and close our eyes when the afternoon light says it's time. Sweet rest, deep peace, and gratitude to the man who showed us that even genius must bow to the body's simple wisdom, must honor what it cannot explain, must practice the ancient art of letting go. Good night.